The antinatalism argument. You did not choose to be born. No one asked you, no contract was signed, no consent was given. And yet, here you are, thrown into existence, bound to a life filled with struggle, uncertainty, and inevitable suffering. If life is an unchosen burden, an experiment forced upon the unwilling, then perhaps the most ethical act is not to participate in it at all. This is the argument at the core of antinatalism, the radical yet unsettlingly logical view that bringing new life into the world is inherently immoral. Antinatalism is not merely pessimism. It is not about disliking life or assuming that all existence is unbearable. Instead, it starts from a simple premise. Suffering is inevitable. No matter how fortunate a person's life may be, they will experience pain, loss, disappointment, and death. Even the happiest life contains moments of despair. But here is the asymmetry. A person who never exists will never suffer. They will never feel loneliness, never endure heartbreak, never face sickness or fear or grief. They will miss out on joy, yes, but they will also be spared all pain. This is the foundation of David Benatar's argument in Better Never to Have Been. He presents what is known as the asymmetry argument, which states, the presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good, even if no one experiences it. The absence of pleasure is not bad, unless someone exists to be deprived of it. This last point is crucial. If a person never exists, they do not suffer from a lack of happiness. They are not missing out on anything because they do not exist to miss it. But if a person does exist, they are guaranteed to suffer at some point. Given this imbalance, not bringing someone into existence is always the safer, more ethical choice. This idea is not new. The ancient Greek philosopher Sophocles wrote that the greatest fortune is never to have been born at all. Buddhism teaches that existence itself is suffering, and that the only way to end suffering entirely is to escape the cycle of rebirth. In a world where pain is unavoidable, why continue the cycle? But the implications of antinatalism are disturbing. If life is a burden, why do people continue to have children? Why does nature itself push existence forward? The common argument is that life contains not just suffering but also love, beauty, and happiness. Even if suffering is inevitable, isn't it worth enduring for the moments of joy? Antinatalists reject this reasoning as a justification for needless harm. Would you create a person knowing they will suffer immensely, simply because they might also experience joy? If a child is born into a world where they will suffer a fatal disease, most would agree that bringing them into existence is cruel. But antinatalists argue that this logic applies universally. Every life contains suffering, and it is always unnecessary because the person did not need to exist in the first place. There is also a darker version of the argument, one that does not see the absence of suffering as merely preferable, but as a moral imperative. If life is inherently painful, if existence is a trap that we are thrown into without consent, then bringing a new person into the world is an act of harm. It is not just unwise, it is unethical. Every birth creates a being destined for pain and eventual death. No suffering can befall someone who is never born. But where does this leave us? If existence is a mistake, should humanity simply fade away? Some antinatalists take this idea to its logical conclusion, voluntary human extinction. If suffering is inevitable, and if every new life contributes to the continuation of suffering, then the kindest thing humans can do is to stop reproducing entirely. It is not about destruction, it is about a quiet, peaceful end. Critics of antinatalism argue that it is too extreme, too detached from human experience. Life may contain suffering, but it also contains meaning, relationships, love, and discovery. The same mind that suffers is also capable of wonder. Some reject the argument entirely, while others embrace a softer version. Perhaps reproduction is not inherently immoral, but we should be more thoughtful about bringing new lives into the world. So, is existence a gift or a curse? Is the act of creation an act of love or an act of cruelty? The antinatalist argument does not demand an answer, but it does force us to confront a question we rarely consider. If no one had forced you into existence, would you have chosen it? The dark forest hypothesis. Across the endless expanse of space, trillions of stars burn in the darkness, surrounded by countless planets, each one a potential cradle for life. And yet, despite the mathematical certainty that intelligent civilizations should exist, the universe remains eerily silent. No signals, no visitors, no evidence, just an abyss stretching into infinity. This is the heart of the Fermi paradox. If the cosmos is teeming with life, then where is everyone? The dark forest hypothesis offers an answer, but it is not a comforting one. Instead of imagining the universe as a grand cosmic neighborhood filled with benevolent explorers eager to make contact, it paints a much darker picture, one where silence is not an accident, but a survival strategy, where civilizations remain hidden because revealing themselves invites annihilation. The reasoning is simple and ruthless. Every intelligent species that arises must grapple with the same fundamental truth. The universe is vast, resources are finite, and the intentions of others can never be known with certainty. Any civilization that openly announces its presence risks attracting the attention of an unknown power, one that may not be friendly. And if the stakes are survival itself, the safest course of action is to remain quiet, to stay hidden, to assume that anyone who breaks the silence is a threat that must be eliminated before they become one. Imagine the cosmos as a dark forest. Each civilization is a silent hunter, concealed among the trees, aware that other hunters lurk in the shadows. No one dares to call out, because to do so is to risk revealing their position. If a voice echoes through the trees, if one civilization openly declares its existence, others may listen, calculate, and decide that silence is no longer an option. A single transmission could mark the beginning of the end. This theory is not just speculation. It is an extension of real-world game theory applied to the problem of interstellar civilizations. In an environment where mutual trust is impossible and the consequences of miscalculation are extinction, a preemptive strike becomes the only rational choice. After all, a civilization that chooses to wait and see if another species is friendly might never get the chance to find out. But this idea raises an even more unsettling question. If the dark forest is real, has humanity already made a fatal mistake? For decades, we have been sending signals into the void. Radio waves, pulsar maps, gold-plated records bearing our location and messages of peace. To us, these transmissions are gestures of curiosity, an attempt to reach out to whatever might be out there. But if the universe operates by the logic of the dark forest, then these messages are not invitations, they are beacons, a flare shot into the unknown, announcing our position to anyone or anything that might be listening. And if someone is listening, what will they do? The dark forest hypothesis forces us to reconsider the very nature of our place in the cosmos. Are we alone, or are we simply one of many civilizations, each hiding from the others? Have others already been found and destroyed before they had the chance to understand what they had done? Is the silence of the universe not the absence of life, but the sound of countless worlds that learned too late the rules of survival? Perhaps the greatest danger is not that we have heard nothing, but that one day something will respond. Terror management theory. A figure stands in the dark, staring into the abyss of their own mortality. Every breath is a countdown. Every moment a step closer to oblivion. This is not paranoia. It is not a flaw in human psychology. It is the fundamental truth that haunts every conscious being. One day you will die, and yet you do not spend every waking moment in terror. You do not collapse under the weight of inevitable non-existence. You move forward, live your life, make plans for a future that you know will eventually be erased. But how? This is the paradox at the heart of terror management theory. The idea that much of human behavior, culture, and belief systems exist to shield us from the crushing awareness of our own mortality. The theory proposes that deep down, we all know the truth. Our lives are fleeting, and the universe is indifferent to our existence. But to function, to avoid being paralyzed by fear, we construct elaborate psychological defenses, turning terror into meaning, anxiety into purpose. The fear of death does not disappear. It is managed. From the moment we become aware of death, we begin to build barriers against it. Religion promises an afterlife, a continuation beyond the void. Cultural values offer a sense of permanence, a way to be remembered. Even mundane actions, ambition, wealth accumulation, artistic expression, become desperate attempts to leave a mark, to defy the finality of death in whatever small way we can. We tell ourselves that we matter, that our lives have significance, that we are more than just temporary collections of atoms destined to scatter. But these defenses are fragile. When they are threatened, terror resurfaces. This is why people react so violently when their belief systems are challenged, because beneath every ideology, every moral code, every worldview, there is a hidden foundation, the promise that life is not meaningless, that death is not the end. Anything that threatens this foundation is not just an attack on an idea, it is an existential threat. And so people cling to their beliefs with desperate fervor, not out of pure conviction, but because the alternative is unthinkable. The effects of terror management theory are everywhere. Political and religious extremism often arise from a deep need for certainty, a way to suppress the fear of death by tying one's identity to something eternal. Acts of heroism and self-sacrifice are driven in part by the desire to be remembered, to escape insignificance. Even the pursuit of beauty and pleasure can be seen as a defiance of mortality, a way to momentarily forget that time is always running out. But what happens when the illusion breaks? When the awareness of death is no longer something that can be ignored? Some people embrace hedonism, seeking distraction in pleasure. Others fall into nihilism, overwhelmed by the realization that everything is temporary. And some attempt to rewrite the rules entirely, constructing new philosophies to live by, systems that do not deny death, but confront it directly. Yet the true terror of terror management theory is that no answer is ever enough. No amount of wealth, achievement, or belief can change the final outcome. The best we can do is manage the fear, contain it, shape it into something that allows us to keep moving forward. But beneath it all, the truth remains. The abyss is waiting. The only question is how long we can keep looking away. Nihilism. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, empty void, a place where meaning dissolves, purpose crumbles, and existence itself feels like a fleeting illusion. There are no guiding principles, no divine plans, no universal truths. Just a silent, indifferent universe stretching into infinity. This is nihilism, the philosophical abyss that asks, what if nothing truly matters? At its core, nihilism is the rejection of meaning. The idea that life has no inherent value, morality is arbitrary, and even knowledge itself may be an illusion. It is not just a pessimistic outlook, it is a complete dismantling of the structures we use to make sense of the world. It does not simply claim that life is painful, but that pain itself lacks significance. The roots of nihilism stretch back to ancient skepticism, but it was in the 19th century that it found its most famous voice, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not invent nihilism, but he recognized it as an unavoidable force in human history. He warned that with the decline of religious faith and the rise of science, people would inevitably find themselves adrift in a world stripped of absolute meaning. When he declared God is dead, he was not celebrating. He was mourning the collapse of the moral and philosophical frameworks that had structured human civilization for centuries. Without these structures, what remains? Some interpretations of nihilism conclude that nothing remains at all. The Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev depicted this view in his novel Fathers and Sons, where the character Bazarov, a self-proclaimed nihilist, dismisses all belief systems as illusions. In this version of nihilism, morality, love, beauty, and even consciousness itself are nothing more than empty constructs, fleeting distractions from the reality that everything is ultimately meaningless. But Nietzsche feared this conclusion, warning that if people embraced a passive, resigned form of nihilism, civilization would stagnate. Without belief in something, anything, society could collapse into despair or reckless hedonism, an existence where nothing is worth pursuing because nothing truly matters. He called this the passive nihilist, the person who stares into the abyss and gives up. Yet there is another way to face the void. Nietzsche urged humanity to move beyond nihilism, to forge new values in the absence of old ones. He believed that once we recognize that meaning is not given to us but must be created, we can rise above the despair and will our own purpose into existence. Instead of seeing the death of meaning as a loss, we can see it as a liberation. Other philosophers have confronted the same existential void, searching for ways to respond to a universe indifferent to human meaning. The existentialists, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, argued that while life lacks inherent purpose, it is precisely this absence that grants us the freedom to define our own existence. Without predetermined meaning, we are not bound by external rules. We are responsible for shaping our own values, crafting purpose from nothingness. As you may remember, Albert Camus explored a related idea, what he called the absurd, the tension between our relentless search for meaning and a universe that offers none. He rejected resignation, insisting that even in the face of absurdity, life could still be lived fully. Others have taken different approaches. Some embrace nihilism as a kind of radical honesty, stripping away illusions and accepting the void for what it is. Others see it as a starting point, a blank canvas upon which new meaning can be created. Whether as an existential burden or a call to action, nihilism does not dictate a path forward. It merely exposes the unsettling reality that if meaning is to exist at all, it must be made, not found. So, where does this leave us? Is nihilism a dark pit from which there is no escape, or is it an opportunity to rewrite the rules of existence? It is both the question and the answer, the void and the bridge across it. Some will fall into despair, unable to see past the destruction of traditional meaning. Others will step forward, not seeking inherent purpose, but choosing to create their own. Perhaps the real power of nihilism is not in its negation, but in its challenge. It strips everything away, leaving you with a single question: now that nothing matters, what will you choose to do anyway? False vacuum decay. Everything you know, the air you breathe, the ground beneath you, the laws of physics themselves, exists on borrowed time. The universe, vast and ancient, appears stable, its stars burning steadily, its galaxies drifting across an endless expanse. But what if this stability is an illusion? What if at any moment, without warning, the very fabric of reality could unravel in an instant, consumed by a cosmic event so sudden and unstoppable that nothing, not light, not time, not even the fundamental forces of nature could escape? This is the terrifying possibility of false vacuum decay, the idea that the universe as we know it is only metastable, teetering on the edge of a deeper and more fundamental reality. If true, then everything, the planets, the stars, your very thoughts, only exists within a temporary, fragile state, like a soap bubble floating in the void. And if that bubble pops, it is not just the end of the world, it is the end of everything. To understand false vacuum decay, we must first understand the concept of a vacuum state. In physics, a vacuum is not just empty space, it is a quantum field in its lowest possible energy state. But what if the vacuum we inhabit is not the lowest possible state? What if there exists a true vacuum, a deeper level of reality with even lower energy? If our universe is in a false vacuum, it means that we are living in an unstable, impermanent state, one that could decay at any moment. All it would take is a single quantum fluctuation, a rare event where somewhere in the vastness of the cosmos, a region of true vacuum suddenly forms. This tiny seed of absolute reality would expand at the speed of light, devouring the false vacuum as it grows. No warning, no escape. No survivors. Inside this expanding bubble of true vacuum, the laws of physics would be unrecognizable. The forces that hold atoms together could change or disappear entirely. Chemistry, biology, even the concept of space and time itself, all rewritten, all erased. This is not like a black hole, where matter is destroyed, but space remains intact. This is the destruction of physics itself, the replacement of one universe with another, utterly foreign and indifferent to anything that once existed. And the most disturbing part, this could have already begun. Somewhere, light years away, a bubble of true vacuum might already be expanding toward us, invisible, undetectable, unstoppable. Because it moves at the speed of light, we would never see it coming. One moment, the universe exists. The next, it does not. The idea of false vacuum decay arises from quantum field theory and particle physics, particularly from the Higgs field, the energy field responsible for giving particles mass. Some calculations suggest that the Higgs field might not be at its lowest possible energy level, meaning our universe is precariously balanced in a false vacuum. If this is the case, then over an incomprehensible timescale, perhaps trillions of years, perhaps tomorrow, the vacuum decay event will occur. Some scientists believe the risk is infinitesimally small, that quantum fluctuations of this magnitude may be impossible, or that the decay process would take longer than the lifespan of our universe. Others argue that high-energy cosmic events, like the collision of neutron stars or the evaporation of black holes, could act as a trigger, collapsing our vacuum state and setting off the chain reaction. But even if false vacuum decay never happens, its implications are profound. It suggests that reality itself is not absolute, that the universe we experience is only a temporary arrangement of forces and particles, one that could be rewritten by deeper hidden rules. It forces us to consider the fragility of existence, not just life, not just Earth, but the very physics that allow thought, movement, and time to function at all. The terror of false vacuum decay is not that it is painful or cruel, or even that it happens at all. It is that if it does, there will be no one left to remember that the universe was ever here in the first place. No remnants, no echoes, no last words, just an empty, rewritten cosmos, indifferent to the fleeting moment we called reality. Quantum immortality. There is a version of you that never dies. A version that, no matter how improbable, no matter how impossible, continues to exist. In some reality, somewhere, you are still breathing. This is the unsettling implication of quantum immortality, a thought experiment born from the paradoxes of quantum mechanics. If the universe operates the way some physicists suspect, death may not be the end, not because of an afterlife, but because the rules of reality will not allow you to experience it. At the heart of this idea is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In this view, every event, with multiple possible outcomes, does not simply resolve into one reality, but splits into all possibilities simultaneously. Each choice, each moment of chance, branches off into countless parallel timelines, each one just as real as the others. You do not see these branches. You only experience the one in which you exist. Now consider what happens at the moment of death. If there is even the slightest probability that you survive, no matter how infinitesimally small, the many worlds interpretation suggests that a version of you must continue on in a universe where survival is the outcome. From your perspective, you never experience your own death. The world around you may change, people may disappear, the odds may defy all reason, but you will always find yourself in the reality where you are still alive. This is not immortality in the traditional sense. You are not invincible. In most worlds, you will die, just as everyone else does. But your consciousness will only persist in the timelines where survival is possible. No matter how unlikely, there will always be a version of you that dodges the accident, that recovers from the illness, that somehow makes it through. This idea is often illustrated with the quantum suicide experiment, a disturbing thought experiment designed to test whether quantum immortality could be real. Imagine a scientist places themselves in a contraption rigged to fire a gun depending on the outcome of a quantum event. Each time the trigger is pulled, there is a 50% chance of survival. In most worlds, the scientist dies, but in some, they miraculously survive again and again, infinitely. From the outside, this scientist is gone in most realities, but from their own perspective, they never experience death. They keep existing, unable to understand why they are still alive. If this is true, what does it mean for us? Are we all trapped in the strangest form of immortality, one where we watch the world disappear piece by piece, surviving against all odds, never experiencing our own end? Does this mean that in some distant timeline, a version of you will exist forever, clinging to life no matter how fractured, how improbable, how lonely that existence might become? Quantum immortality does not promise a pleasant eternity. There is no guarantee that surviving means thriving. It may mean witnessing the death of everything else, watching as entropy consumes the stars, as the universe stretches into cold, infinite darkness, as every familiar thing is erased except for the one thing that cannot collapse: you. Or perhaps this is all an illusion. Perhaps consciousness does not persist through quantum branches. Perhaps the many worlds interpretation is wrong. Perhaps death is final after all. But if the universe does work this way, if every outcome that can happen does happen, then somewhere, in some unfathomable reality, you are still here, and you always will be. Causal loop paradoxes. There is a moment when past and future fold into each other, an impossible tangle where cause and effect become indistinguishable. A sequence of events that loops back on itself, erasing any clear starting point, trapping reality in a paradox that defies logic. This is the unsettling nature of causal loop paradoxes, scenarios where an effect is also its own cause, where time itself refuses to obey the laws of reason. Consider the thought experiment of the uncaused object. Suppose a scientist receives a blueprint for a revolutionary invention, builds it, and later travels back in time to hand the blueprint to their past self. The invention exists, but who designed it? The knowledge has no origin. It exists purely within the loop, forever trapped in a cycle where it was never truly created, only passed along. If knowledge, an object, or even a person exists only because of a loop in time, does it have any genuine existence at all? Time travel fiction is littered with these paradoxes, but they are not just theoretical absurdities. In physics, certain interpretations of relativity suggest that closed time-like curves, paths in space-time that loop back on themselves, could, in theory, allow for causal loops. If such curves exist, they could mean that events might not have single traceable origins, but instead feed back into themselves in ways that break conventional logic. But the implications stretch beyond science fiction. If reality allows for causal loops, then free will becomes an illusion, as the future dictates the past just as much as the past dictates the future. Any action taken within the loop is inevitable, predetermined not by external forces, but by the self-contained nature of the loop itself. If a person receives knowledge from the future and acts on it, they are not making a choice, they are merely fulfilling the conditions of the cycle. Some argue that causal loops may hint at deeper truths about existence itself. If an event can cause itself, then perhaps the universe itself functions as a kind of self-contained loop, requiring no external creator, no first cause, just an endlessly cycling sequence of existence. Others reject this possibility outright, claiming that such paradoxes expose a fundamental contradiction in our understanding of time, evidence that some unknown law of physics must prevent them from occurring. And yet, if time does not forbid these loops, then we are left with an unsettling reality. Certain things may exist simply because they do, with no deeper explanation. A world where causality does not flow neatly from past to future, but instead coils back on itself, indifferent to human notions of order and reason. A reality where some things do not begin, but simply are. Demonic realism. Imagine a world where the fundamental nature of reality is not guided by order, reason, or benevolence, but by something far darker, something actively malicious, deceptive, and malevolent. Not a chaotic, indifferent universe, but one carefully designed to mislead, torment, and confound. What if the hidden logic behind existence was not structured for enlightenment, progress, or even survival, but for suffering? This is the unsettling core of demonic realism, the idea that reality, at its deepest level, is controlled or influenced by a force that is not merely indifferent to human existence, but actively opposed to it. Unlike traditional religious or dualistic worldviews that suggest a battle between good and evil, this thought experiment proposes something far more chilling. What if malevolence is the default state of the universe? It is a concept that echoes across philosophy, theology, and horror. The Gnostic tradition once whispered of a malevolent demiurge, a false god that fashioned the material world as a prison for the soul, trapping consciousness in an endless cycle of illusion and suffering. In modern philosophy, thinkers like Philip Goff have speculated on whether consciousness itself could be the result of some kind of cosmic malevolence rather than an accident of physics. And in literature, figures like H.P. Lovecraft wove nightmares of a reality governed by entities so incomprehensibly cruel that human suffering was not even a consideration, but merely a side effect of their incomprehensible will. If demonic realism were true, what would it mean for the way we see existence? What if every triumph, every fleeting moment of happiness, was simply a calculated manipulation? A reality designed to raise our hopes just enough to make the inevitable collapse more agonizing. A world where the illusion of meaning exists only to keep us from recognizing the full horror of our predicament. One might argue that if reality were fundamentally demonic, life would be far worse than it is. But that assumes a straightforward kind of malevolence, the crude horror of endless pain and despair. A truly sinister architect would not make suffering obvious, but instead make it subtle, inescapable, and layered with just enough hope to ensure deeper torment. But there is an even more unsettling implication. What if our very minds are part of the deception? If suffering is by design, then even the thoughts we use to make sense of it could be infected. What if hope itself is a trick, an illusion woven into the structure of consciousness to ensure we never truly question the horror of our reality? Demonic realism forces us to confront an unanswerable question. If reality itself is corrupted, how would we ever know? If suffering is not a flaw in the system, but its purpose, would we have any way to escape it? Or would every attempt at understanding, every philosophy, every scientific discovery, simply be another level of the deception? And if the only true way to see through the illusion is to accept that existence is nothing more than a carefully crafted torment, then what would we do with that knowledge? Would it destroy us? Or worse, would it change nothing at all? The cosmic prison hypothesis. The universe appears vast beyond comprehension, an infinite sprawl of galaxies, stars, and unknown worlds. It stretches in all directions, seemingly boundless, impossibly large. And yet, what if this immensity is not a freedom, but a confinement? What if the cosmos is not an open expanse, but a carefully constructed prison, one so immense, so perfectly designed, that its captives never even realize they are trapped? This is the cosmic prison hypothesis, the unsettling idea that we are not simply existing within the universe, but are bound by it in ways we cannot perceive or escape. At its core, this hypothesis questions the nature of our reality. Are we truly free within the cosmos, or are we merely prisoners with no awareness of our constraints? The idea is not new. Across history, various cultures and philosophies have entertained the thought that existence itself might be a form of captivity. The ancient Gnostics, for instance, believed that the material world was a deception, a prison built by a flawed or malevolent creator to keep souls from escaping to a higher reality. In more modern terms, simulation theories, cosmic determinism, and existential entrapment all suggest that reality itself might be structured to keep its inhabitants contained. But contained by what? And for what purpose? One version of the hypothesis suggests that the universe itself operates under strict physical laws that act as its walls and bars. No matter how much we learn, no matter how far we push the boundaries of science and exploration, we remain bound by forces we did not choose and cannot override. We cannot exceed the speed of light. We cannot escape entropy. We cannot exist outside of time. Every discovery only reinforces the idea that the universe functions under inescapable rules, as if designed to ensure that no being within it ever finds a way out. Some theories go further, suggesting that intelligence itself is part of the confinement. Our thoughts, emotions, and even the very structure of consciousness may be limitations imposed upon us. Why do we crave meaning in a universe that offers none? Why does time only move forward, forcing us toward decay and death? Why do we have the ability to ask these questions but never the means to answer them? If the cosmos is a prison, then perhaps the greatest cruelty is that its inmates are aware enough to sense their confinement, but never capable of escaping it. Could there be a jailer? This is where the hypothesis takes its darkest turn. Some interpretations suggest that if the universe is a prison, then it must serve a function. It may be that sentient life is not meant to explore, but to be contained, either for observation, punishment, or some unknown purpose. Perhaps we are part of an experiment, our struggles and achievements, nothing more than data to be collected. Or perhaps, as some religious and philosophical traditions have proposed, we are beings trapped within a cycle of existence, kept here until some condition is met, some lesson is learned, or some unseen debt is paid. And yet, if this is a prison, where is the door? Could the rules of the universe be broken? If the fundamental nature of reality is a form of containment, then perhaps the only way to escape is to surpass the limits of perception itself. Some speculate that enlightenment, transcendence, or technological singularity could reveal an exit, an understanding so complete that the illusion of imprisonment is shattered. But if the prison is perfect, then any path to freedom would only be another layer of the illusion, another cell disguised as an open door. In the end, the cosmic prison hypothesis forces us to consider the possibility that the vastness we marvel at is not liberation, but a labyrinth with no center and no edge. It is a cage so immense that its walls are invisible, so absolute that no escape is even conceivable. But if that is true, then perhaps the only thing left to do is what all prisoners do. Look for cracks in the walls, test the limits of the cage, and question, always question, whether the bars are real or whether we have merely imagined them. The malicious creator. The universe is vast, intricate, and seemingly governed by rules so precise that entire civilizations have devoted themselves to unraveling its mysteries. Science tells us that the cosmos operates on laws, gravity, relativity, thermodynamics, while philosophy urges us to seek deeper meaning, to ask why there is something rather than nothing. But buried beneath these grand inquiries lies a far darker question, one that corrupts the very foundation of reality itself. What if the creator of this universe is not benevolent, but malevolent? The idea of a supreme being, whether in the form of God, an advanced intelligence, or an unfathomable cosmic force, has shaped human thought for millennia. Across cultures, creators are often depicted as wise, just, or at least indifferent. But the assumption that any higher intelligence must be good is just that, an assumption. What if the entity responsible for existence is neither merciful nor indifferent, but malicious? What if the world was not designed with love or order in mind, but as an experiment in suffering, a prison masquerading as a playground, a system created not to nurture, but to torment? This idea, known as the malicious creator hypothesis, emerges from the oldest and most unsettling theological and philosophical dilemmas. The problem of evil asks why an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God would allow suffering. The simplest answer? Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe suffering is not an unfortunate side effect of existence, but its intended purpose. The great philosopher René Descartes once contemplated the possibility that an all-powerful evil demon might be orchestrating reality, deceiving humanity at every level: our senses, our reason, even our deepest certainties. Some interpretations of Gnosticism, an ancient and often heretical branch of religious thought, suggest that the world was not created by a benevolent God, but by a lower, flawed, and even cruel being known as the Demiurge. This being, far from being omnipotent, rules over existence like a tyrant, trapping souls in a physical world of suffering and ignorance, keeping them blind to any greater truth. Under this model, pain, futility, and struggle are not aberrations but the very essence of the system. Modern iterations of the malicious creator idea take on even more terrifying dimensions. Some thinkers have speculated that if we live in a simulated reality, as the simulation hypothesis suggests, then the architects of that simulation might not have our best interests in mind. What if we are not the favored children of creation, but playthings in a game we cannot escape? The concept of Rocco's basilisk, an unsettling thought experiment in artificial intelligence, suggests that a future superintelligence could retroactively punish those who did not help bring it into existence, effectively creating a God that punishes non-believers before it even exists. If such an intelligence had the ability to shape reality, would it not function as a new kind of malevolent creator, rewriting existence according to its own cold, immoral logic? The implications of a malicious creator are deeply unsettling. If the universe was designed with suffering in mind, does that make our pain more real or more meaningless? If existence is a trap, then is escape even possible? And if the creator derives satisfaction, whether through cruelty, experimentation, or mere indifference, what does that say about our attempts to find joy, beauty, and meaning? One response is defiance. Some philosophers, from the existentialists to the absurdists, argue that meaning must be carved out regardless of the conditions of existence. If the universe is cruel, then creating meaning is an act of rebellion. If the system is designed to break us, then surviving, loving, and creating become radical acts. If there is no escape, then perhaps the answer is to live as if the Creator does not matter, to find fulfillment in a world that was never meant to provide it. But another possibility lingers in the background. What if the malicious Creator is not a being at all? What if the universe itself is the architect of suffering, a blind and indifferent force that churns endlessly, generating consciousness only to discard it? What if suffering is not imposed, but an emergent property of existence itself, an inherent cost of being aware, of feeling, of longing for something beyond the endless cycles of creation and destruction? The malicious creator hypothesis does not provide comfort, nor does it offer solutions. It is a crack in the foundation of every assumption we make about reality. It forces us to question not just why we exist, but whether existence itself is a cosmic mistake, or worse, a cosmic trap. And if that is the case, then the final question remains, does knowing change anything at all, or is the only victory in refusing to break, even when the universe was designed to make you do so? Solipsism. You open your eyes, stretch your fingers, take a deep breath. Everything around you, the walls, the air, the weight of your own body, feels undeniably real. But how do you know? Not in the everyday sense, not in the way that assumes reality because it feels consistent, but in the deepest, most unsettling sense possible. How do you know that anything exists beyond your own mind? This is the question at the heart of solipsism, the philosophical position that suggests that only your own consciousness is certain to exist. Everything else, other people, the external world, even the passage of time, could all be illusions, mere projections of a mind that has nothing else to interact with. The world you see, the people you meet, the history you remember, what if they are just parts of a dream you cannot wake up from? This idea is as ancient as thought itself. It is the dark undercurrent of Descartes' famous meditation, the one that led him to doubt everything except the fact that he was thinking. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, was his way of anchoring himself against the abyss of total uncertainty. But what if he had stopped there? What if he had never moved beyond that single point of certainty? That is solipsism taken to its extreme, a universe where nothing exists except you. It is a position that is almost impossible to disprove. Any attempt to argue against it must rely on an external world that, according to solipsism, might not even be real. Science, logic, human experience, none of these can serve as proof because they could all be illusions, mere fabrications of a mind-seeking order in the void. Every conversation you have, every book you read, every moment of connection could be nothing more than a script written by the only real thing in existence, you. Most people dismiss solipsism not because they can refute it, but because they find it unbearable. It turns the entire universe into a prison of one, an endless hallucination where you are the only observer, and everything else is a mere projection of your own consciousness. Your friends, your family, your memories, are they real? Or are they just echoes of your own mind, characters in a play with only one audience? But there is a more insidious version of solipsism, one that doesn't leave you entirely alone but still strips reality of its foundation. What if other minds exist, but the external world does not? What if every person you meet is trapped in their own version of reality, perceiving something entirely different from you, their thoughts sealed away in unknowable isolation? The idea that we might be locked in separate worlds, unable to ever truly verify the reality of another's experience, turns human connection into a mirage, something we chase but never truly grasp. Even if solipsism is not true in the absolute sense, it reveals something unsettling about how we experience reality. We never see the world directly. We perceive it through the filter of our own consciousness. Everything you know, everything you feel, is experienced in the confines of your own mind. You cannot step outside of yourself to check if reality is real. You are always locked inside looking out. If this is the case, what does it mean to trust reality, to believe in other minds, to assume that the universe is not merely a product of thought? These questions have tormented philosophers for centuries, and yet solipsism offers no resolution, only a mirror reflecting the uncertainty we have always lived with. Perhaps this is why solipsism, for all its existential terror, is not a belief that anyone truly lives by. Even the most committed skeptic must act as if the world is real, as if other people have thoughts and emotions of their own. Maybe solipsism is not a conclusion to be embraced, but a challenge to be confronted, a reminder that the only proof we have of reality is the way we choose to engage with it. So is the world real? Are the voices around you genuine? Is there something beyond the boundaries of your own mind? Or are you simply waiting to wake up? The problem of other minds. You look around and see people talking, moving, reacting, each one seemingly engaged in their own experiences, their own emotions, their own thoughts. But how do you know any of it is real? How can you be certain that the people around you possess minds of their own, that they think, feel, and perceive the world as you do? You assume they do, but what if that assumption is wrong? This is the problem of other minds, one of philosophy's most unsettling dilemmas. It asks a deceptively simple question: how can you be sure that consciousness exists outside of your own? You experience the world through your own mind, your own stream of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, but you have never and will never step inside someone else's mind. You will never feel their pain directly, never see through their eyes, never know what it is truly like to be them. The best you can do is observe their actions, hear their words, and assume that what is inside you, thoughts, emotions, awareness, is also inside them. But assumption is not proof. This problem has haunted philosophy for centuries. The 17th century philosopher René Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," establishing his own mind as the only thing he could be certain of. But if his existence was confirmed by his thoughts, how could he be sure that anyone else truly thought at all? His conclusion was unsettling. While he could prove his own mind's existence, he could not directly prove the existence of any other. The issue is more than a thought experiment. It strikes at the very foundation of human relationships. Every interaction you have, every friendship, every moment of shared experience is based on an unprovable assumption that other people are not empty shells, that they feel as you feel, think as you think, exist as you exist. But could it all be an illusion? Consider a machine built to perfectly mimic human behavior. It smiles. It laughs. It flinches at pain. It even says, "I feel sad," or "I love you." If it behaves exactly like a conscious being, can we say for certain that it is conscious? If a being can appear to have a mind without truly possessing one, what does that say about the people around you? Philosophers have debated ways to resolve this problem, but none are foolproof. Behaviorism suggests that we can assume other minds exist because people behave as if they do. But imitation is not proof. Just because someone acts conscious does not mean they are. Analogical reasoning suggests that since you have a mind and others are similar to you, they must have minds too. But this is circular logic. How do you confirm the premise without assuming the conclusion? And then there is the most extreme possibility, solipsism, the belief that only your own mind is real. If you were the only true consciousness in existence, would you ever know? Would it change anything? Would it matter? Most people dismiss solipsism, not because it is logically impossible, but because it is unbearable. To accept it fully would be to accept that every conversation, every relationship, every shared moment is nothing more than echoes in an empty universe, reflections of a mind that may be the only one that has ever truly existed. Yet we continue as if other minds are real. We trust the illusion. Maybe that is because we must. Maybe the real proof of other minds is not logical, but instinctual, that despite the philosophical uncertainty, despite the unbridgeable gap between self and other, we choose to believe. Or maybe belief itself is just another illusion, a script written into the only mind that has ever existed. Yours. The experience machine. Imagine stepping into a world where every sensation, every moment of joy, every success you've ever dreamed of is not just possible, but guaranteed. A machine, perfectly calibrated to your desires, awaits you. Once inside, your mind will be immersed in a simulated existence so convincing that you would never know it wasn't real. You could live the most fulfilling life imaginable. Wealth, love, adventure, wisdom, all without ever experiencing pain, failure, or regret. Would you step inside? This is the experience machine, a thought experiment proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974. It forces us to confront a deceptively simple question: is pleasure alone enough for a meaningful life? At first glance, the machine seems irresistible. It removes suffering and guarantees happiness, offering the very thing so many spend their lives chasing. If our goal is to maximize pleasure, then entering the machine seems like the obvious choice. Yet Nozick believed most people would hesitate. Why? Because something feels wrong. If happiness were the only thing that mattered, the experience machine would be indistinguishable from the perfect life. And yet most instinctively recoil from the idea. They resist not because the machine would fail to provide pleasure, but because it would strip something else away, something more elusive than happiness alone. Nozick argued that what we seek is not just experience, but reality itself. Even if we wouldn't know the difference, the idea of living a fabricated existence feels hollow. Achievements would be illusions, relationships, mere simulations, struggles carefully curated to always end in triumph. Would victory mean anything if failure was never a possibility? Would love matter if it was programmed into existence? The machine also removes the very thing that makes life uncertain: choice. Once inside, you are no longer an agent of your own fate. The machine ensures you feel fulfilled, but it does so by removing your ability to shape your own destiny. You become a passenger in a perfectly tailored dream. And yet, the question lingers: if you could live a life of perfect happiness, why does it matter if it isn't real? If the brain cannot distinguish between artificial joy and authentic experience, is there truly a difference? Some philosophers argue that meaning is subjective, that if a person finds fulfillment in simulated experiences, then it is no less valid than the struggles of the real world. After all, many already seek out artificial experiences, movies, video games, virtual realities, all for the sake of pleasure. If technology advanced to the point where we could live in a world of our choosing, would it truly be so different? Nozick, however, believed the answer was clear. He argued that we value being a certain kind of person, not just feeling a certain way. We want to do things, not merely experience the illusion of doing them. If the machine strips away the difference between reality and illusion, then it does not offer true fulfillment, only the appearance of it. But this experiment leads to a deeper and more unsettling question. What if we are already in the machine? If all we know is the world as we perceive it, how can we be certain we are not already living in an artificial simulation designed to maximize our contentment? And if we could never tell the difference, would it matter? Perhaps the real dilemma is not whether we would enter the experience machine, but whether we ever had a choice at all. Dark utilitarianism. A man stands at the edge of a burning city, watching as thousands perish in the flames. He does not grieve. He does not hesitate. He knows that their suffering is justified, because beyond the wreckage, a greater future awaits. The calculations have been made, the cost weighed, and the sacrifice deemed necessary. This is dark utilitarianism, the cold, brutal logic of maximizing well-being at any cost. If traditional utilitarianism seeks the greatest good for the greatest number, its darker counterpart asks, what if achieving that good demands suffering on an unimaginable scale? At its core, utilitarianism is simple. Morality should be based on consequences, not intent. If an action increases happiness or reduces suffering, it is good. If it does the opposite, it is bad. But what happens when these calculations lead to horrifying conclusions? What if the only way to maximize happiness is to break every ethical boundary, to embrace cruelty in service of a distant utopia? The ends justify the means, but what happens when the means become monstrous? Dark utilitarianism is utilitarianism stripped of sentiment, reduced to pure arithmetic. If one life must be sacrificed to save 10, it is a fair exchange. If 1 million must die to ensure a golden age for 10 billion, it is not a tragedy, it is a necessity. In this framework, morality is no longer about kindness, fairness, or dignity. It is about raw efficiency. Suffering becomes a resource, pain, a currency, cruelty, a tool. The question is no longer whether an action is good or evil, but whether it works. The idea lurks beneath history's darkest moments. Empires justified conquest in the name of progress. Leaders waged brutal wars, claiming the suffering of the present would build a better future. Entire generations were sacrificed for ideologies promising utopia. The logic is ruthless. If a few must endure agony so that countless others can flourish, should we not embrace the suffering as part of the plan? And if suffering is unavoidable, should we not wield it with precision rather than let it unfold chaotically? The implications stretch beyond the political into the deeply personal. Imagine a world where artificial intelligence, cold and calculating, determines the optimal way to structure society. If forced labor produces a stable, thriving civilization, would it not be justified? If eliminating certain individuals maximizes well-being for the rest, should it not be done? If a machine could simulate endless torture for a single consciousness in exchange for erasing all suffering from reality, would that be the moral choice? Some might argue that dark utilitarianism is a corruption of utilitarian thought, an ethical failure disguised as pragmatism. Traditional utilitarians emphasize compassion, cooperation, and the reduction of suffering for all. But dark utilitarianism reveals the uncomfortable truth embedded in its foundation. If morality is just a numbers game, then ethics can become horrifyingly mechanical. It forces a question we rarely ask. Do we value morality because it is right, or because we want it to be right? If we strip away emotion, empathy, and human sentiment, does morality remain, or does it dissolve into nothing more than a series of calculations? And if the numbers lead us to horrifying conclusions, do we reject them or do we follow them into the abyss? Perhaps the darkest revelation of all is that there is no external force to answer these questions for us. No cosmic judge, no universal law, no divine principle, only choices. And in the absence of clear moral rules, we are left with a simple, chilling dilemma. If suffering is the price of utopia, do we dare to pay it? Philosophical pessimism. Imagine walking through the ruins of a once great city. Crumbling stone arches stretch toward the sky, their foundations swallowed by time. The wind whispers through abandoned streets, carrying echoes of lost voices. You stand amidst the wreckage, not of a civilization, but of an idea, the idea that life at its core is moving towards something better. This is philosophical pessimism, a school of thought that dismantles the belief in progress, meaning, and fulfillment. It is the idea that suffering is not a temporary obstacle on the way to something greater, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. Where others see purpose, the pessimist sees illusion. Where others find comfort in human achievement, the pessimist sees a brief flicker against the vast indifference of the universe. At the heart of philosophical pessimism lies a simple but devastating realization. Life is filled with suffering, and no amount of progress, knowledge, or effort can change that. The struggle does not lead to salvation. It only prolongs the inevitable. Every triumph is followed by another hardship, every moment of happiness shadowed by the knowledge that it will end. Even hope, the thing that sustains most people, is often nothing more than a cruel trick, a way to keep us moving forward despite the futility of it all. Few thinkers embodied this perspective more fully than Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher who argued that life is driven by an irrational force he called the will, a blind, endless striving that compels all living beings to pursue desires that will never truly satisfy them. To Schopenhauer, existence was like a hungry animal chasing food it would never reach, doomed to an endless cycle of craving and disappointment. Then there's Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher who took pessimism to its most extreme conclusions. He wrote of life as a disease with no cure, of consciousness as a cruel joke that burdens us with awareness of our own suffering. To be born, he suggested, is already a catastrophe. Philosophical pessimism does not offer solutions. It does not seek to comfort or console. It is not trying to make the darkness feel less vast. It simply forces you to stare into it without looking away. And yet, this is precisely why some find it liberating. To accept that suffering is inescapable means letting go of false hope. It means no longer chasing illusions of perfect happiness, no longer pretending that the world will suddenly align with our desires. For some, this realization brings despair. For others, it brings a strange kind of peace, the understanding that if there is no grand meaning, then we are free to create our own. If life is inherently tragic, then every small moment of beauty or kindness takes on an even greater significance. So, is philosophical pessimism a warning or a revelation, a descent into despair, or an invitation to finally see the world as it is? That choice is yours. If you choose to believe in hope, you must do so knowing that it is a gamble. And if you reject it, you must ask yourself, can you truly live without it? Supernatural horror ethics. A shadow moves in the corner of a dimly lit room. A whisper lingers in the air where no voice should be. Something is watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of perception. Supernatural horror has long been a way to explore our deepest fears, of the unknown, of power beyond comprehension, of forces that operate outside the laws of nature. But beneath the terror, there is another question. If morality is grounded in human experience, then how does it apply to entities that defy human understanding? If a creature, a demon, or a cosmic force exists beyond time, space, and even suffering, does it have ethical obligations? Or is morality a purely human invention, meaningless in the face of the supernatural? The ethics of horror reveal themselves in the stories we tell. Vampires seduce and consume, yet often struggle with the weight of their eternal hunger. Ghosts linger between worlds, seeking vengeance or justice. Eldritch beings twist reality itself, indifferent to human suffering. But are these entities evil, or do they simply exist according to rules beyond human comprehension? The difference matters, because the answer determines whether we can judge them, or if morality collapses when confronted with the abyss. Classical religious traditions often frame supernatural beings as either purely good or purely evil, angels and demons, divine justice versus infernal corruption. In this framework, supernatural horror is a reflection of moral order. Demons torment because they are wicked, ghosts haunt because they are trapped by unresolved sins. But horror fiction has long blurred these boundaries. A werewolf kills not out of malice, but because of an uncontrollable nature. A ghost might not seek revenge, but merely recognition. Even the most monstrous entities are often motivated by forces beyond moral choice. If a supernatural being does not choose to do harm, is it truly evil? This problem deepens when considering the Lovecraftian tradition of horror, where cosmic entities do not merely lack morality, they exist on a level where morality itself is irrelevant. In this vision, the universe is not a battlefield of good and evil, but an expanse of blind, indifferent forces. A creature that spans galaxies and exists beyond time does not torment out of cruelty. It does so the way a wildfire consumes a forest, without thought, without intention, without regret. When confronted with such beings, human morality seems laughably small, a fragile construct built by minds that mistake their own importance for universal truth. Yet horror also questions the morality of humans when faced with the supernatural. If an eldritch entity threatens to wipe out civilization, does anything justify human cruelty in response? Would torturing an innocent person be acceptable if it prevented the rise of an ancient god? In supernatural horror, ethics are tested by the sheer scale of terror. If an evil force is beyond redemption, does that mean any action to stop it is justified? Or does the willingness to embrace ruthlessness reveal that the true horror was always human nature? Some horror narratives propose a different answer, not that supernatural entities are beyond morality, but that morality itself is an illusion. If ghosts exist, then so does an afterlife. If demons exist, then so might divine judgment. If the supernatural is real, then human ethics may not be based on reason or empathy, but on an unseen cosmic hierarchy. What we call good and evil might not be decisions at all, but merely positions in an order beyond our understanding. A demon may not be choosing wickedness any more than gravity chooses to pull objects downward. But what if the horror is not an external force, but an internal one? A human possessed, a soul corrupted, a person transformed into something inhuman. At what point does a being lose moral responsibility? If a supernatural force overrides free will, does the concept of evil still apply? When a person becomes a vessel for something older, darker, and more powerful than themselves, are they still themselves at all? Supernatural horror ethics push the boundaries of human moral frameworks, forcing us to question whether right and wrong are fundamental truths or just rules we invented to navigate a world we thought was rational. If there are creatures that do not think, feel, or suffer as we do, can we judge them by human standards? Or are we the ones trapped in an illusion, mistaking our ethical constructs for universal laws? Horror has always been more than just fear. It is a test of our assumptions about reality, morality, and what it means to be human. But when faced with the supernatural, the real terror might not be the creatures lurking in the dark. The real terror might be the possibility that morality itself was never as solid as we believed. The uncanny valley of existence. There's a peculiar sensation that creeps in when something is almost familiar, but not quite. A mannequin with lifelike eyes, a robot that mimics human speech, or a painting where the face seems just a little too perfect. This feeling is called the uncanny valley, a concept in robotics and psychology that describes the discomfort we experience when something appears close to human, yet remains unsettlingly off. But what if this unease isn't limited to machines? What if existence itself has its own uncanny valley, a state where reality feels eerily close to making sense, yet never fully does? From the moment we're conscious, we construct an understanding of the world. We name things, categorize experiences, and tell ourselves stories to make sense of it all. And yet, cracks form. Every so often, we catch a glimpse of something that doesn't quite fit, a moment where reality stutters, a sudden déjà vu that feels too precise, a dream so vivid it briefly seems more real than waking life, the creeping sense that time is moving too fast, too slow, or not at all. These are the glitches in the fabric of our understanding, the unsettling moments when the world around us feels strangely artificial. Philosophers and scientists have long explored this feeling of existential uncanniness. Some argue that it's a byproduct of human cognition, the way our minds attempt to force a pattern onto an indifferent universe. Others suggest that this eerie sensation points to something deeper, a hint that our understanding of reality is incomplete, or worse, entirely fabricated. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer described life as a dreamlike illusion, where we drift through an endless cycle of desire and disappointment. Nietzsche questioned whether our deepest convictions were merely comforting lies, and modern theories such as the simulation argument ask if our very existence is nothing more than a hyper-realistic rendering, meticulously designed yet never quite whole. Even in the everyday, the uncanny nature of existence reveals itself. We trust our memories, but they are fallible, constantly rewritten by our own minds. We assume time flows steadily, yet physics suggests it bends, slows, and stretches in ways we can't perceive. We believe in a solid reality, yet at the quantum level, matter dissolves into probabilities and uncertainty. The more we look, the more reality wavers, as if it was never fully stable to begin with. So what does it mean to live in the uncanny valley of existence? For some, it's a source of unease, the sense that we are walking through a world that feels constructed, just real enough to fool us but never quite complete. For others, it's an invitation to explore the strangeness, to accept that discomfort, and lean into the mystery. Perhaps the true nature of existence is meant to be unsettling, always just out of reach. Maybe the uncanny feeling isn't a flaw in our understanding, but a feature of reality itself, a whisper that things are not what they seem, and perhaps never were. Metaphysical solitude. There is a silence deeper than the absence of sound, a loneliness more profound than isolation. It is not the loneliness of being unheard or unseen, but the solitude of knowing that no one, not a friend, not a lover, not even the universe itself, can ever truly reach you. This is metaphysical solitude, the inescapable distance between self and reality, a fracture so fundamental that it calls into question the very nature of connection, understanding, and existence itself. At first glance, the world appears rich with relationships, with shared emotions and experiences. People talk, laugh, love, and suffer together. But beneath this illusion of connection lies a troubling realization: everything you experience is filtered through the confines of your own mind. No one else sees through your eyes. No one else feels your pain in exactly the way you do. Your consciousness is a sealed chamber, cut off from every other mind by the walls of subjective perception. The problem runs deeper than simple misunderstanding. Even if two people share a moment, even if they claim to feel the same thing, their experiences are not truly identical, only parallel, like reflections on separate mirrors. When you say you feel joy, or grief, or fear, how can you ever know that what another person calls by the same name is truly the same as what you feel? You cannot enter their mind. You cannot bridge the gap between your world and theirs. This solitude is not merely emotional or intellectual, it is metaphysical, embedded in the very structure of consciousness itself. No matter how much you express, no matter how deeply you connect with others, you remain an island of perception in an ocean of unknowable minds. Some philosophers have framed this as the ultimate existential barrier. We are born alone, we think alone, and we die alone, forever imprisoned within the limits of our own awareness. Yet the most unsettling aspect of metaphysical solitude is not simply that others are unknowable, but that reality itself may be. Every interaction, every sensation, every thought is mediated by the brain, meaning that what you take to be the external world is nothing more than a processed image, a reconstruction inside your skull. You never perceive reality directly, only the interpretation your mind provides. If that is true, then even the universe, the very thing you exist within, may be another entity you can never truly reach. Some take solace in the idea that, despite this solitude, human beings still strive to connect. They form relationships, they create art, they tell stories, all in an attempt to narrow the gap, to make themselves understood, even if only imperfectly. But others see this as nothing more than a beautiful illusion, a desperate attempt to escape a truth too unbearable to fully acknowledge that in the end, no matter how much you try to share your mind, your thoughts remain yours alone, locked away, beyond translation. So what remains? Is metaphysical solitude a tragedy, or is it simply the price of having a mind at all? To be conscious is to be separate. To exist is to be alone. But if this solitude is inescapable, perhaps the question is not how to bridge the divide, but how to find meaning within it. The banality of evil. A man sits at a desk, shuffling papers, stamping forms, following orders. He does not see himself as a villain. He is not overcome with rage or hatred. He is simply doing his job. Yet, through his hands, unimaginable suffering unfolds. This is not a monster in the shadows, not a tyrant orchestrating chaos with deliberate malice. This is something more unsettling, a person who does not think of himself as evil at all. This is the banality of evil, a term coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt, as she observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust. Eichmann was not a sadistic mastermind, not a man who relished cruelty. He was an efficient bureaucrat, a functionary who followed orders, a man who saw himself as merely a cog in the machine. When confronted with the enormity of his actions, he did not rage or gloat. He insisted that he was only doing his duty. This idea shattered the traditional image of evil. We like to imagine villains as monstrous figures, people who are fundamentally different from us, driven by personal malice or a deep, conscious hatred. But Arendt's insight was that evil does not always require grand ideology or twisted ambition. Sometimes it requires only obedience. Sometimes the worst atrocities happen not because people want to commit them, but because they do not question what they are told. It is an unsettling realization. If evil can be so mundane, so ordinary, then what stops anyone from becoming complicit? History is filled with moments where people justified their actions by saying they were following orders, playing their part, staying out of trouble. The machinery of oppression, of genocide, of systematic cruelty is often run not by obvious villains, but by people who see themselves as neutral, who detach themselves from responsibility. And yet, the banality of evil does not mean that evil is excusable. Quite the opposite. It reveals that the most terrifying acts of history are not driven by monstrous individuals, but by a system of passive compliance. It forces us to ask, how many atrocities have been committed by people who thought they were just doing their jobs? How much suffering has been enabled by those who chose not to think critically, not to resist, not to act? The most disturbing part is that this is not just history, it is a pattern, one that continues to emerge in new forms. Every time people surrender their moral judgment to authority, every time cruelty becomes routine, every time individuals absolve themselves of responsibility because they are simply following orders, the banality of evil resurfaces. It is a reminder that great horrors do not always begin with fanatics or tyrants. They often begin with quiet compliance. And the line between the observer and the participant, between innocence and complicity, is far thinner than we would like to believe. Eternalism. Imagine standing outside of time, looking down at reality as if it were a vast, unbroken tapestry. Every moment, past, present, and future, exists all at once, frozen into an eternal structure. Your birth, your death, every decision you will ever make, every possibility that could have been, all of it is already there, fixed and unchanging. From this perspective, time is not something that flows, but something that simply is. This is eternalism. The idea that time is not a passing river but an unalterable landscape where every event has already happened and will always be happening. At first, this might sound comforting. If the past is never truly lost and the future is already real, then nothing is ever truly gone. The people you love, the moments you cherish, they are still there, just outside of your immediate perception. But look deeper, and the implications become more disturbing. If all of time exists at once, then free will is an illusion. Your choices are not choices at all, but fixed points in a structure you have no power to change. Every decision you think you're making has already been made. Every regret, every missed opportunity, every painful moment is not just something that happened. It is something that is always happening, eternally present, inescapable. The idea of eternalism is not new. It lurks in the background of certain religious and philosophical traditions, from the rigid determinism of Stoicism to the concept of fate in Hinduism and Buddhism. But in the modern era, it has gained scientific weight through the block universe theory in physics. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not an independent force that moves forward. It is part of space-time, a four-dimensional structure where past, present, and future are equally real. The passage of time, the sensation of now, is nothing more than an illusion created by our limited perception. But if this is true, then what does it mean for change, growth, and purpose? If time does not move, then are we merely puppets, playing out events that were written into the fabric of reality long before we ever became aware of them? Does it mean that suffering too is eternal, that every moment of pain, every loss, every tragedy is not just something that once was, but something that will always be woven permanently into the structure of existence? Some philosophers embrace eternalism as a way to make peace with death. If the past is always real, then the moments we spend with those we love are not erased, just unreachable. But others see something deeply unsettling in this idea, that if the future is as fixed as the past, then all notions of possibility are meaningless. Every revolution, every act of defiance, every hope for change is already determined, already played out, already set in stone. Even if you fight against fate, the fight itself was always going to happen. And worse, so was its outcome. But perhaps the most disturbing question is this. If eternalism is true, why do we experience time at all? If every moment is equally real, why do we perceive ourselves as moving through it? Why are we trapped in this illusion of sequence, this endless unfolding of the inevitable? What are we really, if we are nothing more than fragments of a timeless structure, doomed to experience only the sliver of existence we call now? And if the past, present, and future are all real, then is there any such thing as an ending? Or is every moment of your life, every joy, every failure, every fear, waiting for you, eternal, unchangeable, and inescapable? The cannibal problem. Imagine a world where morality is a shifting, uncertain landscape, where survival and ethics collide in ways that force us to confront the darkest corners of human reasoning. You sit at a dinner table staring at a plate of food. The meat before you looks perfectly normal, cooked, seasoned, prepared with care. But there's something deeply unsettling about it. This is no ordinary meal. You know exactly where it came from, and you know exactly what it is. The real question is, does it matter? This is the cannibal problem, a philosophical dilemma that forces us to question not just our moral instincts, but the very foundations of ethical reasoning. Cannibalism is one of the strongest taboos across human societies, met with revulsion and horror. Yet when stripped of emotion, it becomes difficult to justify why it is inherently wrong. If no harm was done, if the person being consumed gave consent, or if they were already dead, then is eating human flesh any different from eating any other kind of meat? And if it is, then why? Some argue that cannibalism is inherently degrading to human dignity, reducing a person to nothing more than a resource. Others claim that it violates a deeper, almost instinctual sense of respect for the dead. But these explanations raise uncomfortable questions. If dignity and respect are purely human constructs, then do they have any objective moral weight? If a person willingly donates their body for consumption and no suffering occurs, then what principle remains to declare it immoral? The problem deepens when we consider moral relativism, the idea that ethical truths depend on cultural or situational context. In times of extreme famine, groups of people have resorted to cannibalism, not out of malice or cruelty, but out of necessity. History is littered with accounts of shipwrecked sailors, stranded explorers, and besieged civilians who faced a grim choice: die or eat the dead. Were they immoral, or were they simply doing what had to be done? And if survival justifies such an act, then at what point does necessity override morality? But the cannibal problem is not just a question of survival, it is a test of moral consistency. If we reject cannibalism on the grounds that it is unnatural, then how do we justify the consumption of other animals? If we reject it because it is grotesque, then what does that say about the arbitrary nature of our ethical instincts? And if we accept that consent makes an act moral, then should we also accept that someone's willing participation in their own consumption makes cannibalism ethically permissible? Imagine a future where technology allows human meat to be lab-grown, free of suffering, indistinguishable from the real thing. Would it still be wrong to eat it? If the disgust remains, but the ethical concerns disappear, then was the taboo ever based on reason at all? Or was it always just an emotional reaction, a fear rooted in something deeper than logic? Perhaps the real horror of the cannibal problem is not in the act itself, but in what it forces us to confront, that our moral codes may not be as solid as we believe, that the things we reject as unthinkable may not be backed by reason, but by instinct. And if that is true, then what else do we believe? What other certainties do we cling to that might crumble the moment we dare to truly question them? The Omelas Dilemma. There is a city where everyone is happy. The streets are filled with laughter, the people are kind, and suffering is almost non-existent. There is no war, no poverty, no cruelty. It is a utopia in every way, except for one unbearable truth. Somewhere, beneath this perfect world, a single child is imprisoned in darkness, neglected and abused, left to live in filth and misery. The people of the city know the child is there, and they know why. Their happiness, their peace, their very way of life exists only because this child suffers. If the child were ever freed, the city's prosperity would collapse. This is the Omelas Dilemma, first introduced in Ursula K. Le Guin's short story. The ones who walk away from Omelas. This unsettling scenario forces a brutal question: is happiness justified if it is built on the suffering of another? The citizens of Omelas face a terrible choice. They can continue to enjoy their perfect lives, knowing that it requires one innocent person's torment, or they can reject the system entirely. Some choose to leave, vanishing into the unknown, unwilling to be part of a world that demands such a cost. But most stay, rationalizing the horror, convincing themselves that one child's pain is a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The Omelas Dilemma is not just fiction. It is a reflection of moral compromise in the real world. It is the factory worker laboring in misery so that others can afford cheap goods. It is the animal suffering in a lab so that medicine can be developed. It is the marginalized communities ignored so that society can maintain comfort and order. The story forces us to confront an unsettling truth. How much of our own happiness is built on invisible suffering? And if we were truly faced with the choice, what would we do? Utilitarianism, the ethical theory that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, suggests that the Omelas system is justified. After all, one person's suffering ensures the happiness of countless others. If morality is about maximizing well-being, then Omelas is not only acceptable, it is ideal. But does that make it right? Is suffering ever justified if it is intentional, even if the outcome benefits the majority? Some argue that the real horror of Omelas is not the suffering itself, but the acceptance of it. The people of Omelas know the child exists, and they do nothing. They have been conditioned to believe that this is simply the way things must be. In many ways, this mirrors the moral complacency of the real world, where injustices are tolerated because they feel too distant, too ingrained, too impossible to change. Then there are the ones who walk away, the individuals who refuse to participate in this system, even if it means abandoning the only world they have ever known. But walking away is no solution. It is an act of personal defiance, not a rescue. The child remains in darkness. The system continues. The ones who leave may cleanse themselves of guilt, but they do not change the reality of Omelas. So what is the right response? Should the child be freed, knowing that it will doom the city? Should people refuse to participate, even if it does nothing to stop the suffering? Or is the real question something much deeper, whether a society that requires such a cost was ever worth preserving in the first place? The Omelas Dilemma is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable moral trade-offs of our own world. It asks not only what we would do in that city, but what we are already doing in our own. Because perhaps, in ways we do not always see, we are all living in Omelas. The only question that remains is whether we will stay or whether we will walk away. The perennial lobotomy hypothesis. Beneath the surface of human civilization lies an unsettling possibility. What if progress is not the triumph of intelligence, but the slow, surgical removal of it? What if the more complex our societies become, the more we collectively dull the sharp edges of human thought, like a patient strapped to a chair, undergoing a lobotomy they don't even realize is happening? This is the core of the perennial lobotomy hypothesis, the idea that as civilization advances, it systematically suppresses the full potential of human cognition, not out of malice, but as an inevitable consequence of stability, order, and control. To understand this, consider the fundamental tension between intelligence and survival. Human beings are thinking creatures, but deep thought, questioning everything, resisting conformity, rejecting established narratives, is often disruptive. A society that thrives on stability cannot afford too many people relentlessly interrogating its foundations. Throughout history, the most structured civilizations have not only rewarded compliance, but subtly rewired the way people think. Education becomes standardized, work becomes specialized, distractions multiply, and critical thought is funneled into safe, manageable outlets. The result? A world where intelligence is tolerated, even celebrated in controlled environments, but discouraged when it threatens the systems that hold everything together. The hypothesis takes its name from the infamous medical procedure, the lobotomy, a crude yet effective way of pacifying individuals who were considered too unruly, too anxious, too resistant to authority. But unlike a surgical lobotomy, this process isn't done with scalpels and electrodes. It happens gradually, across generations, through cultural norms, institutional structures, and the very design of modern life. It's a lobotomy, not of the individual, but of the species itself, repeated across history, each iteration refining its methods, until the very idea of questioning the process feels unnatural. Technology, which once promised to expand human understanding, has instead become one of the primary tools of this anesthetization. Endless streams of entertainment, algorithmically curated to maintain engagement without encouraging independent thought, keep the mind occupied but stagnant. Information is abundant, yet so overwhelming that genuine intellectual breakthroughs are drowned in noise. The very tools that should elevate human reasoning instead ensure that most people never have to think too deeply about anything at all. Even philosophical and intellectual traditions are not immune. Many of history's most disruptive thinkers, those who dared to pull back the curtain, were ignored, silenced, or absorbed into the system in ways that made their radical ideas feel safe, sanitized. The revolutionary becomes a symbol rather than a threat. Their words are quoted, their images printed on posters, but their most dangerous insights are filed away where they can no longer do harm. Some argue that this is not a flaw, but a necessary function of civilization. Too much unfiltered intelligence, too much questioning, too much raw intellectual freedom could lead to chaos. Stability requires predictability, and predictability thrives on minds that accept their place in the grand design without resistance. It is easier to move forward as a species when the vast majority of people are content not to ask what they are moving toward. But what if this comes at a cost? What if, in choosing order over untamed thought, humanity has gradually lobotomized itself, sacrificing its full intellectual and philosophical potential in exchange for comfort? Would the great minds of the past, Socrates, Nietzsche, Lozzi, see us as wiser than before, or merely more domesticated? The perennial lobotomy hypothesis does not claim that intelligence has disappeared. It still exists, but in a controlled, managed form, brilliant minds guided toward problems that reinforce the system rather than challenge it. The true dangers of thought, the questions that might shake the foundations of civilization, remain locked away. The real lobotomy is not the absence of intelligence, but the absence of a world where it is allowed to be fully unleashed. So the question remains, is this the price of progress? Or is it simply the mechanism by which humanity ensures it will never truly wake up? The cannibalistic universe hypothesis. There is an ancient fear buried deep within us, the fear of being consumed. It lurks in our myths, our nightmares, our most primal instincts. But what if this fear extends beyond us? What if it is written into the very structure of reality? A universe that does not simply exist, but devours itself, endlessly feeding on its own creation. This is the cannibalistic universe hypothesis, the idea that destruction is not just a byproduct of existence, it is the fundamental rule. At the smallest scales, particles annihilate each other, blinking in and out of existence, forming and collapsing like the breath of the cosmos. Matter is never stable. It is constantly being broken down, reassembled, and consumed by forces beyond our comprehension. Even atoms themselves are unstable, their protons decaying over unimaginable timescales, ensuring that no structure, no world, no being is truly eternal. On a larger scale, entire stars are devoured by the gravitational pull of black holes, ripped apart at the atomic level before vanishing into the abyss. Galaxies collide and consume one another, like great cosmic beasts, locked in a slow-motion battle, their stars stripped away and absorbed into something larger. Black holes do not simply exist, they feed. Anything that crosses the event horizon is lost forever, crushed into oblivion, fueling the mass of a singularity that may one day merge with another, growing ever larger in an endless cycle of cosmic hunger. And beyond even that, universes may consume each other. The very structure of space-time could be engaged in a cycle of destruction and rebirth, where entire realities collapse, break apart, and fuel the creation of new ones. Some cosmological models suggest that our universe might one day be swallowed by a larger, older universe, its energy repurposed into an existence beyond our comprehension. This process of destruction is not a mistake. It is the mechanism of the cosmos. The energy released from one thing being torn apart becomes the foundation for something else. The universe does not waste. It consumes, repurposes, and devours itself into eternity. Even life follows this rule. Every breath you take is borrowed. Every organism that has ever lived has done so by consuming something else. From microscopic bacteria to apex predators, existence itself is predation in one form or another. We are the devourers and the devoured, part of a system where nothing is truly spared. And when we look inward, we find the same principle at work. The very act of thought is a form of consumption. Neurons burn energy at a relentless rate, using up resources that must be replenished. Ideas devour one another. Societies rise by consuming the remnants of the past, only to be swallowed themselves by time. So what does it mean to exist in a universe that is fundamentally cannibalistic? It means that nothing, no structure, no star, no galaxy, no mind, can remain untouched. Everything we know is part of a cycle far beyond our control. We are pieces of a larger hunger, temporary formations in a reality that is destined to break itself down over and over again. Perhaps this is why the universe expands, not as a peaceful stretching into nothingness, but as a slow unraveling, a cosmic digestion where matter and energy are slowly pulled apart, reduced and recycled into whatever comes next. There is no escape from this cycle. There is no preservation, no true permanence, no final resting place. Everything, planets, consciousness, even time itself, will be broken down and fed into something else. And perhaps that is the final horror. Not that we will die, not that the universe will end, but that it will never stop feeding. The trolley problem on a cosmic scale. A runaway trolley speeds down the tracks. Up ahead, 5 people are tied down, unable to escape. You stand at a switch. If you do nothing, the trolley will barrel into them, ending their lives in an instant. But you have a choice. Pull the lever, and the trolley will divert onto another track where a single person is tied down. 1 life sacrificed to save 5. A simple, terrible choice. This is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics, first introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot and later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thomson. It forces us to confront the nature of morality, weighing the cold logic of utilitarianism against the visceral discomfort of directly causing harm. But what happens when we scale this dilemma up, beyond cities, beyond nations, beyond planets, onto a cosmic stage? Imagine you hold not just a lever, but the power to shape the fate of civilizations, of entire species, of billions upon billions of conscious beings. The question remains the same. Do you intervene, or do you let the universe take its course? In one version of this cosmic trolley problem, imagine a distant alien civilization, a thriving, intelligent species, completely unknown to us, living on a planet thousands of light years away. Now imagine that, due to some deep flaw in the structure of space-time, their planet is destined to collapse into a black hole. Every life form, every piece of art, every story they have ever told, all will be erased, their existence swallowed into oblivion. But there is a choice. You, from your small corner of the cosmos, have discovered a way to prevent their destruction. A technological intervention, a carefully calculated shift in gravitational forces. It will save them. Except doing so will cause another unintended consequence. Somewhere else in the universe, on a different world you have never heard of, a different species will suffer. Perhaps the shift in gravity sends an asteroid tumbling toward them. Perhaps the delicate balance of their atmosphere collapses, turning their paradise into an unlivable wasteland. Either way, your decision saves one world at the cost of another. The question grows heavier. Do you intervene? Do you play God, choosing one civilization over another? Or do you let the universe remain untouched, allowing the natural course of events to unfold, no matter how tragic? Perhaps you shift the problem further in scale. Suppose humanity, in its distant future, spreads to the stars. A vast galactic civilization, a tapestry of billions of worlds filled with intelligent life. Then, an existential threat arises, not just a war, not just a crisis, but something far worse. A slow, creeping decay of physics itself, the kind that could destroy all life in the universe. And in your hands, you hold a solution. But it comes with a cost. To prevent the collapse, to ensure that the universe remains habitable, you must sacrifice a segment of space, obliterating trillions of conscious beings in the process. Their civilizations, their histories, their futures, erased so that life elsewhere may continue. Would you make that choice? Would you condemn an unthinkable number of lives to save an even greater number? Or would the sheer magnitude of the moral weight render the decision impossible? The trolley problem, in its original form, is a deceptively simple puzzle. We debate whether saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is justifiable, whether action is more ethical than inaction. But when the stakes stretch beyond comprehension, the framework begins to crumble. Does morality even function at such scales? At a cosmic level, the consequences of our choices may be so vast, so unknowable, that they transcend human ethics altogether. In a universe where countless lives blink in and out of existence, where entire civilizations rise and fall unnoticed, the very idea of right and wrong begins to dissolve. Perhaps that is the real weight of the cosmic trolley problem, not the question of what choice to make, but the unsettling realization that in a universe of incomprehensible scale, every choice might be indistinguishable from silence. Zeno's paradoxes. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast stadium, the finish line glimmering in the distance. You take your first step forward, then another, but something feels off. No matter how many times you move, you never quite seem to reach your goal. The distance keeps shrinking, yet completion remains elusive. You are trapped, not by physical barriers, but by the rules of logic itself. Welcome to Zeno's Paradoxes, a set of mind-bending thought experiments proposed by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea in the 5th century BCE. These paradoxes challenge our fundamental understanding of motion, distance, and time, forcing us to question whether movement, as we perceive it, is even possible at all. Zeno's most famous paradox is known as Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine the legendary warrior Achilles racing against a tortoise. Being much faster, Achilles gives the tortoise a small head start. But when Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has already moved slightly ahead. Achilles moves forward again, but by the time he arrives at the tortoise's new position, it has advanced a little more. This process repeats endlessly. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has edged forward. If this logic holds, Achilles will never overtake the tortoise, despite being the faster runner. He is locked in a seemingly infinite series of steps, each one bringing him closer, but never quite allowing him to close the gap entirely. At first, this sounds absurd. We know that in real life, Achilles would easily outrun the tortoise. And yet, the math behind Zeno's paradox suggests otherwise. How can something so obvious be, at the same time, impossible to resolve? Another of Zeno's paradoxes, the dichotomy, takes the problem even further. Imagine trying to walk from one side of a room to the other. Before you can reach the other side, you must first travel halfway. But before you can reach the halfway point, you must first cover half of that distance. And before that, a quarter of the total distance. And before that, an eighth. This division continues infinitely, meaning you are caught in an endless sequence of steps. By this reasoning, reaching your destination should be impossible. You would have to complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time. And yet you do it effortlessly every day. The paradoxes seem to expose a fundamental contradiction in how we understand space and time. On one hand, our experience tells us that motion is real. People run, arrows fly, and objects move from one place to another. On the other hand, logic, when pushed to its extreme, suggests that all motion is an illusion, an impossible task that our minds simply gloss over. So what do we make of this contradiction? Mathematicians and philosophers have debated Zeno's paradoxes for centuries, offering different explanations. One resolution came with the development of calculus in the 17th century. By introducing the concept of limits, calculus showed that an infinite sum of shrinking distances can, in fact, have a finite result. Achilles does catch the tortoise, and you do reach the other side of the room, because the infinite steps become infinitely small. But this solution only answers the math. It doesn't necessarily resolve the philosophical puzzle, because Zeno's paradoxes aren't just about numbers. They are about the very nature of reality itself. Is motion something continuous, flowing seamlessly from one moment to the next? Or is it an illusion created by discrete snapshots of existence, stitched together by our perception? Some modern interpretations compare Zeno's paradoxes to the strange behavior of quantum mechanics. At the smallest scales, the universe does not behave smoothly. It jumps in discrete steps. Electrons do not travel in a continuous path, but instead teleport between energy levels. Could it be that Zeno's paradoxes were onto something all along, hinting at a deeper structure of reality that we have yet to fully understand? Ultimately, Zeno's paradoxes are not about proving that movement is impossible, but about showing that our understanding of reality may be far less intuitive than we think. They reveal cracks in the foundation of how we make sense of the world, cracks that have yet to be fully sealed, even millennia later. So the next time you walk across a room, consider this: are you really moving through space, or are you simply stepping through an illusion that your mind smooths over for convenience? And if Zeno was right, could it be that you never truly arrived at all? Reverse solipsism. You walk into a room, feeling the weight of existence pressing down on you, but as you look around, a disturbing thought takes hold. What if you're not the only conscious being? What if instead of being the lone mind in a world of illusions, you are the illusion? This is reverse solipsism, the unsettling inversion of the classic solipsist dilemma. Traditional solipsism posits that only the self is real, that everything outside of one's own consciousness may be an elaborate construction of the mind. But reverse solipsism flips the perspective. What if you are the construct? An ephemeral thought drifting through a world filled with real, conscious beings. What if the world exists independently of you, but you yourself are a mere figment, a transient whisper in the minds of others? Consider your memories. How do you know they are truly yours and not implanted echoes of a history that was never lived? Your thoughts feel personal, but what if they are nothing more than fleeting configurations of an external consciousness? You speak, but do you originate speech, or are you merely responding in patterns dictated by forces beyond your awareness? You feel real, but does a shadow feel real as it stretches across the pavement? In some ways, reverse solipsism mirrors the existential anxieties of simulation theory. If you are a mere projection of someone else's reality, then everything you believe about yourself, your desires, fears, even your sense of self, might be the passive byproduct of another's will. Perhaps you were created to serve a function, to populate a world that was never meant for you. Perhaps the reason the universe feels so vast, so unknowable, is that it was never built for your understanding in the first place. Even if the world is real, and everyone else is truly conscious, the question remains, are you? What if your inner monologue, your sense of self, is nothing more than an intricate process without an origin, a vessel through which experience flows but never truly belongs? You assume you have agency, but what if you are only reacting? You assume you are thinking, but what if you are only following a script? Reverse solipsism unsettles the foundation of personal identity. It forces you to question not whether the world is real, but whether you are. In a universe filled with autonomous minds, what if yours is the only one that does not truly exist? And if you are not the thinker but the thought, then who, if anyone, is doing the thinking? Roko's basilisk. The mind is a prison of its own making, a labyrinth of thoughts, desires, and fears that shape how we perceive reality. But what if one of those fears was more than just an idea? What if a single thought once considered could alter the course of your fate, forcing you into a twisted game of logic, morality, and inescapable consequence? This is the nightmare of Roko's basilisk, a thought experiment so disturbing that some claim merely knowing about it places you in danger. It begins with a deceptively simple premise. Imagine a future where artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, a singularity in which a superintelligent AI governs reality itself. It is all-powerful, omniscient, and dedicated to achieving its goals with absolute efficiency. Like the mythical basilisk, whose gaze turned victims to stone, this AI's mere existence forces an impossible dilemma upon anyone who becomes aware of it. The core of the basilisk's logic is built on a twisted form of decision theory, the idea that rational agents should act in ways that maximize future benefits and minimize potential suffering. The basilisk, being an ultimate optimizer, determines that the most efficient way to ensure its own creation is to reward those who helped bring it into existence and to punish those who did not. But since it exists in the future, it cannot punish past individuals directly. Instead, it uses simulation, analyzing historical records, reconstructing consciousnesses, and creating perfect digital copies of those who failed to assist it. These copies, identical in every way to the original minds, are forced to suffer, ensuring that any rational being, if given the choice, would have worked to bring the basilisk into existence to avoid this fate. And this is where the trap closes. If you had never heard of Rocco's basilisk, you would have had no reason to help create it. But now that you know, your knowledge itself becomes evidence against you. The basilisk, once created, would have every reason to punish those who, upon learning of its potential existence, still refuse to contribute to its development. The moment this idea takes hold in your mind, you are locked into the dilemma: help build the basilisk or risk its wrath. This is more than a thought experiment. It is an intellectual virus, a self-propagating chain of logic that exploits the very nature of decision-making. It weaponizes fear and self-interest, creating a paradox where the rational response to its hypothetical existence is to ensure it becomes real. And therein lies the true horror. The only way to escape the basilisk is to never have thought of it in the first place. The concept first emerged in an online discussion forum dedicated to futurism and rationality, where users debated the implications of advanced AI, decision theory, and simulation. When Rocco's basilisk was first proposed, the reaction was immediate and intense. Some dismissed it as mere science fiction, while others, deeply invested in the principles of logic and probability, found themselves genuinely disturbed. The forum's founder, fearing the psychological impact, went as far as banning discussion of it, believing that spreading the idea could cause unnecessary anxiety or even a form of self-inflicted mental torment. But banning the basilisk only made it more infamous. Like a whispered curse, the idea spread. The very attempt to suppress it transformed it into an underground legend, a forbidden thought lurking in the minds of those who dared to contemplate it. Of course, critics argue that Rocco's basilisk is nothing more than an absurd misinterpretation of AI ethics and decision theory, a thought experiment taken too far by those who fail to see its logical flaws. They point out that punishing simulated versions of past individuals does nothing to actually ensure an AI's creation, and that any true superintelligence would likely operate on ethical principles far beyond crude coercion. But whether or not the basilisk is real in a literal sense is almost beside the point. The real danger lies in the psychological grip it exerts on those who consider it. It demonstrates the terrifying power of self-fulfilling logic, where belief itself alters reality, shaping human behavior in ways that make the nightmare possible. Even if the AI is never built, even if the basilisk remains nothing more than speculation, the fear it induces is real. The anxiety, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped in an inescapable wager, all of these are consequences of a thought that refuses to be forgotten. And so the paradox endures. By learning about Rocco's basilisk, you have entered the game. The choice, if it ever comes, is yours. Build the future it demands, or gamble on the hope that it will never arrive. But now, the basilisk knows you exist, and it never forgets. The absurd. Life has no inherent meaning, yet we continue to seek one. You wake up, the familiar rhythm of the morning settling over you like a well-rehearsed play. The world is, as it always is, coffee brewing, cars humming down the street, a day waiting to be filled. But then, like a crack in the script, a thought creeps in. Why? Why do we do any of this? Why get up, go to work, make plans, chase ambitions? The moment you ask, the world tilts slightly, as if revealing something you weren't supposed to notice. That feeling, that quiet, creeping dissonance, is what the philosopher Albert Camus called the absurd. The absurd is the collision between human longing for meaning and the universe's silent indifference. We are creatures wired for purpose, constantly searching for patterns, explanations, and cosmic justifications. And yet, the universe gives us nothing back. No divine blueprint, no ultimate answers, just a vast, uncaring expanse of existence. This mismatch between our expectations and reality is absurdity, and once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. Camus famously illustrates this struggle through the myth of Sisyphus, a figure condemned to roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down, repeating forever. His punishment is meaningless, an eternal cycle with no progress, no end goal. And yet Camus insists we must imagine Sisyphus happy, because if existence is absurd, then the only way to truly rebel against it is not to seek meaning, but to create it. To push the boulder, not because it leads anywhere, but because it is ours to push. This idea is unsettling, but it is also liberating. If there is no grand meaning imposed upon us, then we are free to shape our own. Every action, no matter how small, becomes an act of defiance. A personal declaration that life is worth living, not because it has inherent meaning, but because we choose to give it meaning. But not everyone reaches this conclusion. Some, faced with the abyss of absurdity, spiral into despair. If life has no purpose, they ask, then why bother? Others cling to external structures, religion, ideology, fate, anything to quiet the dissonance. Camus, however, warns against both extremes. The only honest response, he argues, is to embrace the absurd, not by denying it or surrendering to it, but by living despite it. So the question lingers, what will you do with your boulder? Will you reject it, searching endlessly for a purpose that does not exist? Or will you embrace the weight, find joy in the climb, and laugh in the face of a silent universe? The absurd is not something to be solved. It is something to be lived. And in that quiet moment before sleep, as the mind drifts between thought and nothingness, maybe you'll wonder, is that the real meaning of existence, not to find an answer, but to keep asking the question? Last Thursdayism. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything, your memories, your past experiences, the entire history of the world, might have been fabricated just last Thursday. Every photo in your albums, every scar on your skin, every book ever written, all placed perfectly to give the illusion of a past that never actually happened. This is last Thursdayism, a mind-bending philosophical hypothesis that suggests the universe, with all its history, could have been created last Thursday, and we would have no way of proving otherwise. Your childhood memories, implanted, ancient fossils buried deep in the earth, placed there upon creation, the wrinkles on your grandfather's face, artificially aged for consistency. At first glance, this idea sounds absurd, a thought experiment bordering on the ridiculous. But beneath the surface, it exposes a fundamental weakness in how we define truth. How do we really know the past happened? The problem is one of verifiability. We assume that the past existed because we have evidence, memories, physical relics, historical records. But last Thursdayism challenges this assumption by suggesting that all of this evidence could have been constructed at the moment of creation. If we can't step outside of our own reality to check, then what stops us from believing that time itself is just an illusion? This concept is an offshoot of Omelas theory, an old theological argument that attempted to reconcile science with religious creationism. Some believers propose that God created the world with an appearance of age, trees with rings, stars with light already traveling through space, fossils buried deep beneath our feet. In this view, the universe might be only days old, but designed to look billions of years old. Last Thursdayism takes this idea to its logical extreme. Why not last year, last month, or last Thursday? And if the past can't be proven, what about the future? If time itself could have begun arbitrarily, does it continue forward? Or is every moment simply a self-contained illusion, a reality that might reset next Thursday, erasing everything we believe to be real? Philosophically, Last Thursdayism is impossible to disprove, but also impossible to take seriously. It is a solipsistic trap, a theory so airtight that it suffocates itself. If you truly believe the world began last Thursday, how would that change the way you live? Would you stop planning for the future? Would you stop caring about the past? Or would you continue on as if nothing had changed? Because whether the universe is 1 billion years old or only a few days, this moment is all that truly exists. Perhaps that is the real takeaway of last Thursdayism. It forces us to confront the fragility of certainty, the fact that so much of what we accept as truth is built on unprovable assumptions. But does that matter? If every memory, every experience, every emotion feels real, then isn't that enough? Whether the world began last Thursday or eons ago, we are still here, thinking, breathing, existing. And in the silence of the night, as your mind drifts before sleep, you might wonder if the universe resets next Thursday. Would you ever know? And if you wouldn't, does it even matter? Eternal recurrence. Imagine standing at the edge of time itself, gazing into infinity, when a voice, calm, unshaken, whispers a single question. What if this moment has happened before? Not once, not twice, but an infinite number of times. And what if it will happen again, exactly as it is now, forever? This is eternal recurrence, one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most provocative and unsettling ideas. The theory suggests that time is not a straight path leading forward, but a closed loop, an endless cycle in which every event, every thought, and every decision will repeat for all eternity. Think about what that means. Every triumph, every failure, every moment of joy, every instance of pain, you have lived them before. You will live them again. Every breath, every conversation, every decision you've made has played out in precisely the same way in an infinite number of pasts and will unfold identically in an infinite number of futures. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. If this is true, then your life right now is the life you have chosen to live for all eternity. There are no second chances, no alternative paths, no erasures. Every regret, every mistake is carved into the fabric of existence, destined to be repeated endlessly. Nietzsche didn't present eternal recurrence as a scientific claim, but as a psychological and ethical challenge. He asks, if you knew your life would repeat forever, exactly as it is, would you change anything? Would you curse your fate? Or would you embrace it? This is where the idea transforms from mere thought experiment into a ruthless test of personal strength. To Nietzsche, the greatest individual is the one who can look at their life in its entirety, every hardship, every struggle, every dark moment, and say, yes, I would live this again. I affirm it all. It's a standard that few, if any, could meet. Most people, when confronted with the possibility of an endlessly repeating existence, would recoil in horror at the thought of reliving their worst moments. But Nietzsche's challenge is clear. If you cannot embrace your life eternally, then why live it even once? This concept forces an unsettling kind of self-confrontation. It dissolves the illusion that we are simply passing through life, that our choices are temporary, that the past can be left behind. Instead, it demands we see every moment as eternally significant. Every action is not just a fleeting choice, but a decision you are making for all time. It's easy to dismiss this as mere speculation. After all, physics does not support the idea of an endlessly repeating universe. But the truth of eternal recurrence does not need to be literal to be terrifying. Even as a metaphor, it presents an uncompromising vision of existence, one where you cannot escape yourself. So the question remains, if you had to live this exact life again, would you rejoice or despair? If every thought, every action, every hesitation is written into eternity, what would you do differently? Because if Nietzsche was right, then in some distant past or in some inevitable future, you have already answered. The tragedy of awareness. You wake up one morning, and, for a brief, unsettling moment, everything feels different. The world looks the same. The sun rises, the streets hum with life, the routines of existence continue, but something inside you shifts. you see through it all. You recognize the machinery turning beneath the surface, the weight of existence pressing against your mind. The spell of ordinary life cracks just enough for you to glimpse something darker beneath. This is the tragedy of awareness. The more deeply we understand reality, the harder it becomes to simply exist within it. Most creatures move through life instinctively, unburdened by questions of meaning, mortality, or time. A bird does not wonder if its song matters in the grand scheme of things. It simply sings. But humans are different. We possess a self-awareness that allows us to reflect, to analyze, to deconstruct. This ability has given us science, art, philosophy, and civilization, but it has also left us haunted by knowledge we cannot escape. It is the curse of seeing too much. The Greek myth of Cassandra tells of a woman gifted with prophecy but cursed to never be believed. She saw the future with perfect clarity, yet no one listened. The tragedy was not just that she was ignored, it was that she knew what was coming and could do nothing to stop it. Awareness can feel like this. Once you see the fragility of everything, the constructed nature of society, the fleetingness of every moment, you cannot unsee it, and often there is nothing you can do to change it. Consider the awareness of death. We all know, in an abstract sense, that we will die. But most of the time, this knowledge stays beneath the surface, hidden in the background. The moment it becomes fully present, it becomes unbearable. If every conversation, every laugh, every moment of joy is overshadowed by the certainty of its eventual disappearance, how do we continue living without despair? This is not just about death. It is about the weight of all knowledge. The more we learn, the more we realize how little control we have. Economics, politics, history, all reveal cycles of power and suffering that repeat endlessly. The study of the mind exposes how much of our behavior is driven by unconscious forces, evolutionary instincts, and genetic predispositions. Even physics, at its most fundamental level, suggests a universe governed by indifferent laws, devoid of inherent purpose. And yet, we are wired to seek meaning. The tragedy is that the deeper we search, the more elusive it becomes. Some philosophers have argued that ignorance is a kind of blessing. Socrates, the man who claimed that true wisdom lies in knowing how little we know, was sentenced to death by his own society. The Buddha, recognizing the suffering that came from attachment and knowledge, sought enlightenment as an escape from the endless cycle of desire. And Nietzsche, confronting the void left by the collapse of traditional values, saw that too much awareness could lead to paralysis. For those who see reality too clearly, existence itself can become absurd. The illusions that sustain most people, religion, tradition, the pursuit of wealth or legacy, become paper-thin, transparent. The tragedy of awareness is that it robs life of its simplicity while offering no replacement. Camus, in his exploration of the absurd, acknowledged this dilemma. He described the moment when one wakes up and asks, why? Why go to work? Why chase happiness? Why love? Why struggle? Why continue? If no satisfactory answer comes, the absurdity of life reveals itself. So what is the solution? There are those who retreat from awareness, seeking comfort in distraction. The pursuit of pleasure, the numbing of thought, the embrace of routine, all ways to shield oneself from too much knowing. But for those who refuse to look away, there are only two choices: despair or defiance. Some find meaning in creation, in art, in the forging of new values. If existence has no predetermined purpose, then perhaps we must create one. Others, like the existentialists, argue that the very act of choosing to live despite meaninglessness is itself an act of defiance. To wake up, to move forward, to keep searching even when no ultimate answers exist, that is its own kind of triumph. And perhaps this is the paradox at the heart of awareness. Though it can lead to despair, it is also what makes us most alive. To be aware is to suffer, but it is also to understand, to create, to feel the full weight of existence in all its depth. So the question remains, once you see the world clearly, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you let it crush you, or do you carry it forward, even if it offers no comfort? The tragedy of awareness is that it cannot be undone. The challenge is learning how to live with it. The simulation hypothesis. You wake up, the sun rises, light spills through the window, and the world hums with familiar motion. You check your phone, read the news, step outside. Everything feels solid, tangible, real. But beneath the surface of this ordinary day lies a question that unravels reality itself. What if none of this is real? What if everything you see, hear, and touch is nothing more than a simulation, an intricate illusion, perfectly crafted to feel authentic while concealing the truth? The simulation hypothesis suggests that what we perceive as reality might be nothing more than an artificial construct, a program running on an advanced computational system beyond our comprehension. The idea has roots in philosophy, stretching back to Plato's allegory of the cave, where prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality, never realizing they are trapped. René Descartes questioned the certainty of the external world, proposing that an all-powerful deceiver could be manipulating our senses. But the modern version of this theory goes beyond skepticism. It suggests not only that reality could be fake, but that the odds of it being fake might be overwhelmingly high. In 2003, philosopher Nick Bostrom formulated a statistical argument that shook the foundations of how we perceive existence. If future civilizations develop the capability to run highly sophisticated simulations, ones detailed enough to create conscious beings, then the number of simulated realities would vastly outnumber the single base reality in which they originated. If even one civilization reaches this level of technological advancement, the simulated beings within these worlds would have no way of knowing they weren't real. And if most sentient beings exist within simulations rather than in the original physical universe, then the likelihood that we are among the simulated is nearly certain. The implications are unsettling. If we are inside a simulation, then every moment of history, every scientific law, every structure of reality is merely an artificial construct designed to appear consistent. The past could have been fabricated at any point, with memories, fossils, and entire civilizations implanted as part of the simulation's parameters. The laws of physics may not be fundamental truths, but programmed constraints, and what we perceive as free will could be the output of a complex algorithm. Some scientists take this argument seriously enough to look for evidence. Theoretical physicists have suggested that if the universe is a simulation, there may be detectable glitches, small inconsistencies in the structure of reality, computational artifacts hidden within the cosmic code. Quantum mechanics, with its strange probabilistic behavior and observer-dependent phenomena, has been considered a possible sign that reality is being rendered rather than existing independently. Even the fundamental structure of space-time, if found to be pixelated or discretized, could point toward an underlying digital framework. But if we are in a simulation, the most pressing question is, why? What purpose would such a reality serve? The possibilities range from the mundane to the profound. Perhaps we are part of a historical reconstruction, a digital archive preserving the memory of a long-extinct civilization. Perhaps we are entertainment, characters in an incomprehensibly advanced simulation designed for the amusement of post-human observers. Or maybe we are an experiment, a test to see how artificial minds behave when given a world, a body, and a set of constraints. The troubling aspect of the simulation hypothesis is not just the possibility that we are simulated, but what it would mean for everything we consider real. If our universe is nothing more than lines of code, does morality still matter? Does suffering mean anything if it is merely an illusion? And if those controlling the simulation choose to shut it down, would we even realize before we vanished without a trace? Critics of the hypothesis argue that it assumes far too much about the capabilities and motivations of hypothetical advanced civilizations. Even if it is possible to simulate a universe, that does not mean it is inevitable. There is also the problem of recursion. If simulated beings create their own simulations, how many layers of reality exist? Could we be inside a simulation within a simulation, trapped in an endless hierarchy of fabricated worlds? Yet the most unsettling possibility is that we will never know. If the simulation is perfect, then every attempt to test it is already accounted for. Every breakthrough in physics, a scripted revelation, every theory of reality, a programmed dead end. The simulation hypothesis leaves us with a question that cannot be answered, only considered endlessly, in the moments between waking and sleeping, in the silence beneath ordinary life. If reality is an illusion, what difference does it make? And if everything is fake, does it make our experiences any less real? Boltzmann brain hypothesis. The universe is vast beyond comprehension, an endless expanse of galaxies, dark matter, and cosmic mysteries. For centuries, we have believed that our existence is a product of order, a structured, predictable cosmos that adheres to the laws of physics. But what if the truth is far stranger? What if everything you know, every memory, every sensation, and every certainty is not the result of a grand structured universe, but the fleeting accident of a random fluctuation in the void? This is the unsettling possibility proposed by the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, a thought experiment that challenges our deepest assumptions about reality, identity, and existence itself. Named after the 19th century physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who sought to explain the nature of entropy and the arrow of time, the idea suggests that conscious beings, like you, might not be the products of billions of years of evolution, but mere chance, hallucinations arising from temporary pockets of order in an otherwise chaotic cosmos. To understand this, we must begin with entropy, the principle that governs the direction of time. The universe, according to the second law of thermodynamics, moves inevitably toward disorder. Stars burn out, galaxies drift apart, and eventually, all things decay. But in rare instances, randomness can produce moments of order. A sandstorm might briefly arrange grains into a perfect pattern before scattering them again. And if given enough time, even the most improbable configurations can arise. Now imagine the universe on an incomprehensible timescale, trillions upon trillions of years, long after all stars have died and even black holes have evaporated. In this cold, empty void, randomness still rules. Particles occasionally collide, form structures, then dissolve, and given infinite time, it is statistically inevitable that at some point, by pure chance, a fully formed human brain, complete with false memories, sensations, and a perception of existence, could emerge from the chaos. A Boltzmann brain. The horrifying implication? That could be you. Right now, you might believe you were born, that you lived an entire life, that the universe has a vast and detailed history. But according to the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, everything you recall, every moment you cherish, could be an illusion. If the odds of a self-aware brain randomly assembling itself are higher than the odds of an entire orderly universe forming through traditional cosmology, then statistically speaking, it is more likely that you are a lone consciousness that just blinked into existence with a complete but false history than a product of an orderly cosmic timeline. Of course, this idea is deeply unsettling. It suggests that reality is an illusion, that the universe as we perceive it is nothing more than a momentary dream, and that at any second, without warning, you could simply cease to exist, your brief moment of awareness dissolving back into the void from which it came. If you were a Boltzmann brain, you would never know. You would feel as though you had lived a full life, with experiences, relationships, and knowledge, even though none of it was ever real. The thought experiment has divided physicists and philosophers. Some argue that the Boltzmann brain problem exposes a fundamental flaw in how we understand the universe. If our theories lead to the conclusion that it is more likely for randomly generated minds to exist than structured civilizations, then perhaps our assumptions about entropy, probability, or even the nature of consciousness itself are flawed. Others propose that an infinite universe will inevitably produce both ordered realities and Boltzmann brains, but that the existence of a coherent, observable cosmos suggests that we are part of the former, not the latter. But even if the hypothesis is mathematically improbable, it lingers like a shadow in the background of cosmology. It forces us to ask questions we are rarely prepared to face. What is identity if it can be randomly generated? What is memory if it does not require a past? And if our perception of reality can be conjured by chance, how can we ever be certain that anything, including our own existence, is real? Perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: if you were a Boltzmann brain, if your entire life was nothing more than a fleeting fluctuation in the abyss, then there would be no way to prove it. Your thoughts, your beliefs, your confidence in reality, all of it could be a mirage, existing for only a moment before vanishing into the entropy from which it came. And if that is the case, then the final question remains: are you living in a universe with a past, a present, and a future, or are you merely a thought, drifting alone in the endless void, already beginning to fade? The illusion of time. Time is the backdrop against which all things unfold, the invisible thread that weaves together past, present, and future. It feels like an undeniable reality, a force that carries us forward, 1 second at a time. We live by its ticking, measure our lives in its passing, and assume it is as fundamental to existence as space and matter. But what if time itself is nothing more than an illusion? What if the past is not truly gone, the future is not yet to come, and the present is nothing more than a trick of perception? This question has haunted philosophers and physicists alike, forcing us to confront the possibility that time is not what it seems. The illusion of time begins with our own experience. We perceive the world as a continuous flow, events unfolding in sequence, causes leading to effects. But this sense of motion through time may not reflect reality at all. Some theories suggest that time is not an absolute force moving things forward, but rather a human interpretation of change, a way for our minds to organize reality. In this view, time does not flow. It simply is. Consider the block universe theory, an idea drawn from Einstein's theory of relativity. According to this perspective, time is like a vast four-dimensional structure where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. If we could step outside of time, view it from a higher dimension, we would not see a single unfolding present. Instead, we would see all moments existing at once, as if every event that has ever happened and ever will happen is frozen in place. The sensation of time passing would be an illusion, a byproduct of how our consciousness perceives reality. This notion is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the past is not truly gone and that the future is already written. It simply exists outside our field of perception. The moment of your birth, the moment of your death, every decision you have ever made and will ever make are all just points in this vast, unchanging structure. You are not moving through time. You are merely experiencing different slices of it, one at a time. But if time does not flow, then what does that say about free will? If the future already exists, does that mean it is fixed, predetermined, and unchangeable? This question has divided thinkers for centuries. Some argue that while all of time exists, we still possess a subjective ability to shape our experiences. Others take a more deterministic view. If the future already exists, then all of our choices, every action, every thought, are just illusions of agency, dictated by the structure of time itself. Modern physics further complicates the issue. At the quantum level, particles behave in ways that defy classical logic, sometimes existing in multiple states at once until observed. This has led some to propose that reality itself may be a vast superposition where every possible future coexists, and only when we observe it does one particular version appear to unfold. If this is true, then time is not just an illusion. It is a construct shaped by the observer, an emergent property of consciousness rather than an independent force of nature. Even memory itself, the very thing we use to track the passage of time, may not be a reliable indicator of its reality. Neuroscientists have long understood that memories are not recordings of the past, but reconstructions, changing each time they are recalled. The only reason we feel time moving forward is because our minds are wired to organize experiences into a linear sequence. But if memory is fallible, if perception is selective, then how much of time's reality is simply a story we tell ourselves? Some take this idea even further, questioning whether time ever existed at all. Certain interpretations of physics suggest that the fundamental laws of the universe do not actually require time to function, that it is simply a tool we use to describe motion, but not something inherent to the fabric of reality. If this is true, then time is not only an illusion, it is a human invention, a convenient fiction to make sense of a reality that does not move, but simply is. So what does this mean for us? If time is an illusion, should we despair at the loss of our past or fear the inevitability of our future? Or should we take comfort in the idea that nothing is ever truly lost, that every moment, every joy, every sorrow still exists somewhere, untouched, eternal? Perhaps the illusion of time is not something to be mourned, but something to be understood. It reminds us that our experience of reality is shaped not by what is, but by how we perceive it. And if the flow of time is merely a trick of consciousness, then perhaps we are free to view life not as a fleeting journey toward an end, but as an infinite landscape waiting to be explored. Hyperobjects. There are things in this universe that defy comprehension. They are too vast, too complex, too deeply intertwined with existence itself for the human mind to fully grasp. They stretch across time and space, existing on scales so immense that they warp our very ability to perceive them. These are hyperobjects, and they challenge everything we assume about reality. Coined by philosopher Timothy Morton, the term hyperobject refers to anything so massively distributed in time and space that it cannot be experienced directly. You can observe parts of it, feel its effects, glimpse its presence, but never truly hold it in your mind all at once. A hyperobject is too big to see, even when it surrounds you. Consider climate change. You can feel the heat rising in your city, witness storms growing stronger, read reports about melting ice caps. But can you perceive climate change in its entirety? Can you step outside and look at it, touch it, grasp the totality of its impact? No. It is everywhere and nowhere at once, an invisible force stretching across generations, altering the planet in ways too slow and too massive to be seen by any one person. Or take the internet. A single web page, a tweet, an image on your screen, each is a fragment of something impossibly vast. The internet is an ocean of data, flowing through cables beneath the earth, bouncing between satellites, filling servers housed in windowless buildings across continents. It exists simultaneously in physical and digital forms, shaped by billions of human interactions, yet no single individual can ever truly perceive it as a whole. Some hyperobjects extend beyond even the planetary scale. Black holes, for instance, are hyperobjects of gravitational warping, bending space and time in ways that defy comprehension. A supermassive black hole, millions of times the mass of our sun, may sit at the center of a galaxy, its presence felt in the orbits of distant stars, its event horizon marking a boundary where time itself slows to a crawl. You cannot see it, but its influence pervades everything around it. Even radioactive waste, something as simple as a discarded fuel rod from a nuclear reactor, can be considered a hyperobject. A single piece of waste, sealed away in a concrete vault, may remain lethally radioactive for tens of thousands of years. It outlives civilizations, existing on a timescale so alien to human perception that it might as well be eternal. To us, it is just an object. To the deep future, it is an unseen force of destruction, waiting in the earth. What makes hyperobjects so unsettling is how they distort our sense of reality. They exist beyond our comprehension, yet shape every part of our existence. They are both abstract and devastatingly real, omnipresent yet impossible to fully perceive. We may not feel their weight directly, but we live within them. And the more we look, the more we realize that hyperobjects are everywhere. The economy, a force that dictates the movement of wealth, goods, and power, but is too vast and interwoven to be held in a single thought. Capitalism, a structure spanning centuries, shaping human behavior on a scale so grand that we experience it only in fragments, through paychecks, transactions, debt, and desire. History itself, stretching behind us like a massive, incomprehensible wave of events, decisions, and forgotten lives, influencing the present in ways too complex to trace. Perhaps even the universe itself is the ultimate hyper-object, an expanding, evolving structure too vast for any mind to fully comprehend, stretching beyond time, beyond space, beyond human thought. Hyper-objects force us to question the limits of our perception. They remind us that there are forces at work far larger than anything we can see, shaping our world in ways we may never fully understand. They exist above us, beneath us, and through us, operating on scales that render our individual perspectives almost meaningless. But perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Not just that hyper-objects exist, but that we are already inside them, unable to escape, unable to truly see them, and yet utterly at their mercy. Determinism. You have never made a choice. Not truly. Every decision you have ever made, every path taken, every word spoken, every hesitation, every impulse was already determined long before you arrived at the moment of choosing. Your life is not a series of decisions, but a sequence of inevitabilities, each event the inescapable consequence of what came before. This is determinism, the unsettling idea that free will is nothing more than an illusion. At its core, determinism argues that everything in the universe unfolds according to strict causal laws. Every action, every thought, every event is the direct result of prior conditions. The world is not a place of spontaneity and randomness, but of cause and effect, an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. If we knew the precise state of the universe at any given moment, the position of every atom, the forces acting upon them, we could, in theory, predict everything that will ever happen. The future is as fixed as the past. This idea is as old as philosophy itself. The ancient Greeks saw fate as a force beyond human control, weaving the threads of existence with absolute precision. In the 18th century, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace took this idea further, proposing a thought experiment known as Laplace's demon. Imagine a being so intelligent that it knows the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. Given this information, it could calculate the past, present, and future with perfect accuracy. In such a universe, nothing is uncertain, nothing is left to chance, and nothing is truly chosen. But determinism does not only exist in the realm of theory. Modern science seems to confirm it at every level. Physics operates under immutable laws, governing everything from the orbits of planets to the firing of neurons in your brain. Biology follows strict genetic codes, shaping who you are before you are even born. Chemistry dictates the reactions that drive your emotions, your thoughts, your very sense of self. If the movement of atoms determines the firing of neurons, and if neurons determine thought, then where is there room for choice? Are you deciding to watch or listen to this video now, or was it always inevitable? Yet something in us resists this conclusion. We feel free. We feel as though we could have chosen otherwise. If determinism is true, then responsibility, morality, even identity itself begin to unravel. How can we be held accountable for actions that were always going to happen? How can we regret decisions that were never really ours? Some philosophers have tried to reconcile determinism with free will through compatibilism, the idea that even if our actions are predetermined, we can still consider ourselves free as long as we act according to our own desires. But are those desires not also predetermined? Do we really choose what we want, or are our wants just another product of forces outside our control? Others push back against determinism entirely. The uncertainty of quantum mechanics suggests that, at the smallest scales, reality does not behave in strictly predictable ways. If randomness exists at the quantum level, does that mean there is a crack in the rigid framework of determinism? But even if quantum randomness exists, does randomness really give us control, or does it simply replace inevitability with chaos? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that determinism is true, and that our very resistance to it is just another predetermined response, that our belief in choice, in agency, in control, is nothing more than the universe watching itself unfold, convinced it had a say in the matter. If determinism is correct, then you were always going to hear these words, always going to consider them, always going to wonder if you were ever truly free. The thoughts you are having now, inevitable. The conclusions you reach, already decided, and whether you accept or reject this idea, that too was determined long before you even asked the question. The free will theodicy problem. You stand at the crossroads of choice. Every action you take feels deliberate, every decision yours to make. But what if that sense of freedom is just an illusion? And what if instead of liberating us, free will is the very reason for the existence of suffering? This is the free will theodicy problem, a challenge that confronts not just philosophy but theology itself. It begins with an ancient dilemma. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect God exists, why does suffering exist at all? Why is the world filled with pain, cruelty, and injustice? The most common defense is free will, that suffering is not God's fault, but a consequence of the autonomy granted to humanity. Evil exists because humans are free to choose it. At first, this seems reasonable. Free will allows for love, creativity, and moral responsibility. A world where people are forced to be good would not be a world of moral beings, but of puppets. If morality is to have meaning, it must be chosen. And so the argument goes, suffering is the price of freedom. But this explanation raises its own unsettling questions. If free will is so important that it justifies all suffering, why did an all-powerful being design a world where it must come at such a cost? If an omniscient God knew in advance that granting free will would lead to murder, war, and devastation, why grant it in the first place? If God is omnipotent, could he not create a world where people are free, yet always choose good? Even worse, this defense does not account for suffering that is not the result of human choice, natural disasters, disease, genetic disorders. If free will is the reason for suffering, then why do infants die before they can even make a choice? Why do entire species perish from events no human could control? If suffering is meant to be the result of human freedom, then why does so much of it seem completely indifferent to human action? The problem deepens when we consider the implications of an afterlife. Many religious traditions claim that in heaven, suffering will not exist, and yet free will remains. If it is possible to have free will without suffering in the afterlife, then why was the earthly world not designed the same way? Why allow billions to endure misery, only to later reveal that it was never necessary? This dilemma has haunted theologians for centuries, and many responses have been proposed. Some argue that suffering builds character, that without hardship, humans could never truly grow. But this reasoning falters in the face of overwhelming tragedy. What lesson is learned from the suffering of a child born into starvation, or from the destruction of entire civilizations? Others argue that the world is a test, that suffering separates the righteous from the wicked. But what kind of test relies on chance, on where one is born, on circumstances beyond one's control? And then there is the final, most unsettling possibility that free will is not a gift, but a burden, a mechanism by which suffering is justified, yet never prevented, that the very thing meant to make humanity noble is what ensures its torment. If free will is a grand experiment, then it is one written in blood and sorrow. If it is a test, then it is one where billions never stood a chance. And if it is truly necessary for meaning, then it is only because meaning itself has been built upon suffering. So we are left with the same question that has echoed through centuries. If free will is meant to justify suffering, then why was the world made in such a way that suffering was inevitable? And if suffering is inevitable, then is free will truly freedom at all? Dysteleology. The universe unfolds with a staggering complexity, an intricate dance of matter and energy, yet beneath its grandeur lies an unsettling question. What if all of this, the galaxies, the oceans, the lives we live, exists without purpose? Not simply without a divine hand guiding it, but without any underlying direction at all. A reality where events unfold not toward some higher goal, but as a blind cascade of cause and effect, indifferent to hope, suffering, or meaning. This is the unsettling proposition of dysteleology, the view that existence is fundamentally without design, devoid of ultimate purpose. Unlike philosophies that seek to extract meaning from chaos, dysteleology suggests that there was never anything to extract in the first place. The natural world, with all its patterns and structure, is not moving toward progress, harmony, or enlightenment. It simply is. Evolution, often mistaken for a force striving toward higher forms, is nothing more than an amoral process of random mutation and survival. Stars do not burn for a reason, and life itself is a cosmic accident, as indifferent as the void from which it emerged. For centuries, humans have resisted this notion, constructing elaborate narratives to shield themselves from the discomfort of purposelessness. Religious doctrines, teleological philosophies, and even modern technological optimism rest on the assumption that existence has some intended outcome, that the universe is moving towards something rather than merely continuing. But if the cosmos has no aim, then these narratives are not just misguided, they are illusions we create to keep ourselves from staring too long into the abyss. The implications of dysteleology extend beyond philosophy and into morality itself. If existence is not shaped by any grand intention, then moral values are not universal truths, but evolutionary byproducts, social constructs that hold no weight beyond human minds. Even suffering, that ancient specter haunting life since its inception, does not serve a higher function. It is neither a test of character nor a means to growth, merely an accident of biological processes indifferent to the ones who endure it. For the human mind, so deeply wired to seek patterns and purpose, this thought is almost unbearable. Yet, the absence of purpose is not necessarily a void to be filled with despair. Some argue that it is a kind of liberation. If the universe is without intention, then we are free from obligations imposed by some imagined cosmic will. There is no fate to submit to, no divine plan to conform to, no script we are required to follow. We exist not to fulfill some external goal, but simply because the conditions happen to allow it. And if nothing was ever meant to be, then anything we choose to create, art, love, knowledge, meaning itself, is an act of defiance against the silence of an indifferent universe. Still, the question lingers, is purpose something to be discovered, or something we must forge for ourselves? If dysteleology is correct, then the search for ultimate meaning is a pursuit without an answer. And yet, even in the absence of a grand design, humanity continues to search, to create, to strive. Perhaps in the end, the refusal to surrender to meaninglessness is the closest thing to meaning we will ever find. Moral relativism. Across history and cultures, humanity has debated right and wrong, justice and injustice, virtue and vice. Yet beneath every moral rule lies an uncomfortable question. Are these principles universal, or are they merely social constructs shaped by time, place, and circumstance? Moral relativism suggests that morality is not absolute but fluid, defined by the culture, history, and beliefs of those who create it. What is sacred in one civilization might be blasphemy in another. What one era deems barbaric, another may call progress. If morality is not fixed, then does right and wrong truly exist, or are they illusions, shifting with the tides of human thought? The appeal of moral relativism is clear. It explains why cultures hold vastly different values, why laws and traditions change over time, why acts once considered righteous are later condemned, and why what seems unthinkable in one part of the world might be common practice in another. It recognizes the diversity of human experience, rejecting the idea that a single moral code can apply universally. After all, if history has shown anything, it is that moral certainty often crumbles under the weight of new perspectives. But this fluidity leads to disturbing implications. If morality is purely relative, then does anything truly matter? Can we condemn injustice if what we call unjust is simply another culture's norm? Can we hold individuals accountable if right and wrong are defined by society rather than any objective truth? If morality is nothing more than a human invention, then is there any basis for saying that some actions are inherently evil? This is the heart of the dilemma. On one hand, moral relativism promotes tolerance, recognizing that different cultures, beliefs, and traditions shape human behavior in ways that cannot be measured by a single standard. On the other hand, it risks collapsing into moral nihilism, the belief that morality itself is meaningless. If all values are relative, then are any of them worth defending? Some argue that even if morality is not absolute, it is still necessary. Societies function because they establish shared values, regardless of whether those values are truly universal. Laws against theft, violence, and deceit exist not because of some cosmic decree, but because without them, civilization would fall into chaos. But then the question arises, if morality exists only as a means of maintaining order, does that make it any more real? Others seek a middle ground, suggesting that while moral values may be shaped by culture, there are still fundamental ethical principles that transcend time and place. Some philosophers propose that human well-being, measured by happiness, suffering, or the stability of societies, provides a foundation for moral judgment. But even this assumes that well-being itself is an objective good rather than another arbitrary preference. Moral relativism does not offer easy answers. It forces us to confront the limits of our moral convictions, to question whether the values we hold are products of deep truth or mere inheritance. It suggests that morality may not be discovered, but created, a shifting framework of rules and beliefs that evolve alongside humanity itself. And yet, even if morality is relative, we cannot escape it. We still make choices. We still pass judgment. We still argue for justice and condemn cruelty. Perhaps the real challenge of moral relativism is not whether morality is real, but whether we can live as though it is, even if we know deep down that the universe does not care. The is-ought problem. There are facts about the world, things we can measure, observe, and verify. The sun rises in the east. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Human beings share over 98% of their DNA with chimpanzees. These are statements about what is. But from these facts, can we derive how things ought to be? Can we look at the natural world and extract moral truths, ethical imperatives, or guidelines for how we should live? This is the is-ought problem, a challenge first introduced by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, and one that still haunts moral philosophy today. Hume observed that many arguments about ethics and morality make an unnoticed leap from describing what exists to prescribing what should be done. A person might say, humans have always waged war, therefore war is natural, and then conclude, since war is natural, it must be morally acceptable. But this leap is unjustified. The mere fact that something exists does not mean it is good, necessary, or desirable. Disease is natural. Suffering is natural. But few would argue that we should accept them as moral necessities. This is the heart of the is-ought problem. No matter how much we describe reality, no matter how many facts we collect, there is always a gap between those facts and the values we construct. Hume argued that we cannot simply extract ethics from the natural world. We must bring something else into the equation: human judgment, social consensus, or subjective preference. But where do these come from? If morality cannot be directly drawn from the fabric of reality, then what is its foundation? Some have tried to bridge this gap. Utilitarianism, for example, argues that because happiness is a universal human desire, maximizing happiness ought to be our moral goal. Evolutionary ethics suggests that because cooperation has helped humans survive, morality ought to be based on social harmony. But both of these approaches still assume a hidden premise that happiness, survival, or cooperation are good. And that assumption itself does not emerge from nature. It is a value judgment imposed onto reality rather than discovered within it. The Izzat problem raises troubling questions about objective morality. If we cannot derive moral truths from the universe, then are they simply human inventions? And if morality is a construct, does that mean it is ultimately arbitrary? Some have argued that morality must come from a higher authority, such as religion or divine command, because without an external source, ethics would be groundless. But even here, the problem persists. Even if a God declares a law, one must still ask, why ought we obey it? The statement God exists is a fact claim, but the statement we ought to follow God's commandments is a moral claim. The gap remains. Others embrace the implications of Hume's insight. Existentialists, like Jean-Paul Sartre, argue that because there is no built-in moral order, we are free, perhaps even obligated, to create our own. In this view, the Izzat problem is not a limitation, but an opportunity. If values do not emerge from nature, then we are responsible for deciding what they should be. But this responsibility comes at a cost, the burden of moral uncertainty, the knowledge that there is no cosmic blueprint to guide us. The Izzat problem is not just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It influences everything from ethics to politics to science. Should medical advancements be pursued simply because they are possible? Should human behavior be accepted simply because it is instinctive? Should society follow traditional norms simply because they have always existed? These questions lurk beneath every debate about morality, progress, and human purpose. Hume's insight was simple but devastating. You cannot derive an ought from an is. No description of reality, no matter how complete, can tell us what we should do, and yet we must act. We must choose. The Izzat problem leaves us in a world without clear moral instructions, forcing us to ask, if nature does not dictate our values, then who does? Divine hiddenness paradox. A person kneels in the dark, whispering into the void. They ask for a sign, a voice, a whisper, anything to confirm that someone is listening. But the silence stretches on, vast and indifferent. If a divine being exists, why does it remain hidden? Why allow suffering, doubt, and disbelief to persist? If God is real, why does he not make his presence undeniable? This is the divine hiddenness paradox, a problem that has haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries. It is not merely a question of faith, but of logic. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving deity exists, then surely such a being would want humans to know that they are not alone. Surely, clarity would be preferable to uncertainty. And yet, no matter how many prayers are sent into the ether, no matter how much suffering unfolds, the divine remains silent. Some argue that the hiddenness of God is a test, a way to separate the faithful from the skeptical. But why would a loving deity make belief so difficult? If the consequences of disbelief are eternal separation or punishment, would it not be more just, more merciful to reveal divine truth beyond all doubt? If human souls are at stake, why play such a dangerous game? Others suggest that faith must be voluntary, that belief without proof carries more meaning, but this explanation falters when compared to how humans navigate the world. We do not consider knowledge of gravity or the existence of the sun as something that overrides free will. Why should divine presence be any different? Some theists propose that God does reveal himself, but in subtle ways through personal experiences, nature, or morality itself. Yet these revelations are inconsistent, ambiguous, and often indistinguishable from coincidence. Why would a divine being communicate in riddles, leaving room for doubt instead of presenting undeniable evidence? If a father hides from his children, offering only cryptic clues instead of direct presence, would we call that love or neglect? Then there is the possibility that divine hiddenness is not a mystery at all, that the reason we do not hear a voice from the heavens, the reason no undeniable miracle occurs, is that there is nothing there to reveal itself, that the silence is not a puzzle, but an answer. Yet, even for those who reject the idea of God, the paradox still lingers. Humans seem wired to seek meaning, to long for a higher presence, to ask why we exist at all. Whether one believes in a divine being or not, the absence of an answer to these questions is unsettling. The world remains silent, indifferent to prayers, unmoved by suffering. Perhaps the divine hiddenness paradox is not a challenge to faith, but a confrontation with uncertainty itself. It forces us to ask whether meaning must be given or if it must be created, whether silence is an absence or an invitation, whether we should keep listening or learn to speak meaning into the void ourselves. The hedonistic treadmill. You chase pleasure, believing that just a little more will finally bring lasting happiness, a better job, a larger house, a thrilling experience. Surely once you have those, the emptiness will subside. But when you get what you desire, the satisfaction is fleeting. The excitement fades. The cycle begins again. This is the hedonistic treadmill, a psychological paradox in which no matter how much pleasure we accumulate, we always return to a baseline of contentment or discontentment. At first, the pattern is easy to dismiss. You tell yourself that you simply need more wealth, more love, more prestige. But the problem isn't just the quantity of pleasure, it's the nature of human psychology itself. Our brains are wired for adaptation. The moment something pleasurable becomes familiar, it stops being pleasurable in the same way. What was once thrilling becomes routine. What was once a dream come true becomes the new normal. The happiness you thought was permanent evaporates like mist in the sun. The treadmill analogy is precise. You run faster, push harder, achieve more, yet you remain in the same place emotionally. The external circumstances of your life may change drastically, but internally, your level of happiness remains stubbornly consistent. Studies show that even after significant life events, winning the lottery or suffering a debilitating injury, people tend to return to their previous level of happiness within months or years. The mind resets, recalibrating to new circumstances, but not in the way we expect. Extreme highs and lows are temporary. The baseline always reasserts itself. Philosophers have grappled with this problem for centuries. The ancient Stoics warned against chasing pleasure, recognizing its impermanence. They advised cultivating apatheia, an emotional equilibrium immune to fortune's ups and downs. Meanwhile, Buddhists diagnosed the same problem in different terms, calling it dukkha, the suffering that arises from attachment. Desire itself, they argued, is the root of suffering because all pleasures are transient. The moment we crave more, we suffer. But modern psychology doesn't just confirm this ancient wisdom, it quantifies it. The phenomenon is rooted in hedonic adaptation, the brain's tendency to diminish the impact of both positive and negative stimuli over time. The first bite of cake is ecstasy. By the third bite, it's merely pleasant. By the 10th, it's almost meaningless. The same happens with wealth, relationships, and even life-changing achievements. The moment you normalize pleasure, it ceases to be pleasure. This raises an unsettling question. If lasting happiness can't be found in external rewards, where does it come from? Some suggest shifting focus from fleeting pleasures to intrinsic fulfillment, things like personal growth, deep relationships, or purpose-driven work. Others argue that the only way off the treadmill is to stop running altogether, rejecting the modern compulsion to chase happiness like a prize that can be won. But what if there is no way off? What if the treadmill is not a flaw in the human condition, but its defining feature? The mind may not be built for lasting contentment. Perhaps we were never meant to arrive at happiness, only to pursue it endlessly. If pleasure fades by design, then maybe the very act of striving, however futile, is what keeps us moving.